The London Assembly is the voice of London, composed of 25 members elected at the same time as the Mayor in order to hold him to account and to scrutinise his policies. This is a Mayor's Question Time meeting of the Assembly, which means that all members are invited to attend and ask questions of the Mayor. Indeed, it is the final Mayor's Question Time at the current City Hall before the home of London government moves east to the Crystal. Can I welcome to the public gallery students from St Michael's Catholic College, Bermondsey. Where are they? Are they? Well, they will be here when they get here. They're still in the queue downstairs. Apologies. May I remind members that in accordance with current safety guidelines, face masks are encouraged to be worn in the chamber unless speaking or unless you are medically exempt. Members are also reminded that any electronic devices should not be placed in front of microphones. So, to start, can I also ask the clerk, Rebecca Arnold, to confirm any apologies for absence, please?
Thank you, Chair. We have apologies from Assembly members Duval, Fortune and McCartney.
Thank you. I begin with an update on recent Assembly activities since the last full Assembly meeting. Our committees have once again been very busy. The Environment Committee discussed waste and recycling as part of the circular economy. The Transport Committee examined the work of Crossrail and TfL ahead of the initial opening of the Elizabeth line. The Police and Crime Committee conducted a question and answer session with the Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime and the Metropolitan Police Service. And the London Youth Assembly has held the first meeting of its new term with a new chair and deputy chair. We now move on to declarations of interest. Can I ask the Assembly to note the interest set out at item 2? And do Assembly members have any other disclosable pecuniary interests which relate to the items on the agenda for today's meeting, or any other relevant interests, including any declarations in relation to gifts and hospitality which are not reflected on the authority's register of gifts and hospitality? Thank you. We now move on to the Mayor's report. Can I ask the Assembly formally to receive the Mayor's report covering the period from the 1st of October to the 4th of November 2021? The Mayor will now provide an oral update of up to 5 minutes in length on matters occurring since the publication of his report. Good morning, Mr. Mayor.
Good morning. There's a lot to report since the last time we came together, but I feel I must use my opening statement today to focus on one particular issue that's coming to a head, an issue that could have very significant consequences for our city. Over recent months, I've not said much publicly about Transport for London's extremely difficult financial situation. There's a reason for that. City Hall and TfL have sought to work constructively behind the scenes with the government, trying to negotiate a long-term settlement that would benefit London and the whole of our country. We'd hoped for an announcement about additional funding in the Treasury's recent spending review, but nothing materialised. With no apparent movement by ministers and with time fast running out before TfL's temporary emergency funding deal comes to an end on the 11th of December, I feel it's my duty as Mayor to start sounding the alarm, because the situation TfL faces and the potential knock-on consequences for millions of Londoners is grave. Let me quickly remind the Assembly and Londoners of how we got to where we are now. During the pandemic, we saw TfL passenger numbers plummet by up to 95% during lockdown. At the same time, we had to continue operating services for key workers. This hit revenues hard. Passenger numbers have been increasing again, but they are still not back to where they were before the pandemic. Given the extent of the financial crisis that's been created, we can't solve it alone in London. We need government support. Yet despite repeated warnings, ministers are refusing to provide enough investment to maintain vital services. If the government continues to starve TfL of funding, bus services will have to be reduced by 18% and tube services by 9%. There would also be an increase in road and tunnel closures. Overall, the cuts would cause widespread disruption and gridlock across the capital. Not only would this have a devastating effect on passengers, but it would put the national economic recovery at risk. There can be no national economic recovery without a London recovery, and there can be no London recovery without a properly funded public transport network in the capital. I'm a big advocate for greater transport investment in regions of our country that have been neglected for far too long. But levelling up must not be about dragging down London and regions in the south of England. Clipping the wings of London is not the answer if you want to help other cities and regions to soar. It's my job to stand up for London, so with just over 3 weeks to go until the temporary TfL funding deal ends, I call on the government to start working with TfL in good faith to protect London's transport system for the sake of the capital and the whole country. Chair, I've been asked for 3 oral updates as well. The first one is from Senator Member Zach Polanski on COP26 and 1.5 degrees. Thank you for your question. The Glasgow Climate Pact does not meet the scale of the challenge. We are on course for a 2.4 degrees Celsius world. The difference between 2.4 and 1.5 degrees warming is terrifying. We saw some progress with pledges to cut methane and nature solutions being recognised with forest protection and deforestation commitments. Countries agreed to come back next year to tighten emissions, and the Paris rulebook setting out monitoring arrangements was agreed. But the agreement did not phase out coal. We saw some finance to support nations in the global south, but developed countries failed to keep their pledge for $100 billion by 2020. Countries on the front line deserve to have loss and damage addressed urgently. Now countries must rise to the challenge and keep 1.5 alive by halving emissions by 2030. I've committed to net zero by 2030, and I'll do everything in my power to tackle the climate emergency, and I urge our government to do the same. Chair, there's also a request for an oral update from Senator Leonie Cooper, also on COP26 and coal. Thank you for your question and your continued interest in this matter. The Glasgow Climate Pact was the first time coal and fossil fuels were explicitly acknowledged as the problem. But the last-minute watering down of the ambition to phase out coal was incredibly disappointing. To keep warming to 1.5 degrees, coal and all fossil fuels should be phased out, not down. Let's hope our government takes a lead on this in its decision over the new coal mine proposed in Cumbria and the Cambo oil field in the North Sea. The greater recognition of adaptation at COP26 was welcome, although financing commitments fell far short of what was needed. I'll continue to lead the way in London. I've set a net zero target for 2030, and I'm leading a retrofit revolution, investing in green public transport and sustainable energy sources, minimising waste and mobilising the finance we need to support the transition to a low-carbon economy. I'm determined to deliver a green and fair recovery from the pandemic by tackling the twin dangers of air pollution and the climate emergency. Chair, I've been asked for a third oral update from Senator Member Emma Best. Thank you for your question. It's on the night tube. I was the mayor that first introduced the night tube, and so I've been clear that reintroducing night tube services on the Central and Victoria lines from Saturday, the 27th of November, is the right thing to do for London's economic recovery and to ensure Londoners have the widest possible range of safe late-night travel options. The return of the night tube is a pivotal moment for our city's recovery, and I'm delighted that we will soon have 2 lines operational again. TfL is confident that this dispute with the RMT will not delay the reintroduction of the night tube, although unfortunately it may have an impact on service levels. TfL has been meeting with the RMT union through ACAS to try to resolve issues related to the return of the night tube. TfL remains open to talking further, and I've called on the RMT to call off these strikes, come back to the table and work with TfL to bring back full night tube services on these lines. Night Overground, which runs between Highbury and Islington and New Cross Gate, is also due to return on Friday and Saturday nights from Friday the 17th of December, as TfL continues to play its full role in London's recovery from the pandemic. Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member.
I'm sorry, this is the last Mayor's Question Time meeting in this purpose-built venue, and I'm surprised that he hasn't updated us on it. Is it because you're embarrassed that the crystal's not going to be ready by Christmas as you promised?
Assembly Member Hall, you have an opportunity to ask the Mayor to report back on those issues prior to.
I know,
prior
just
to the
one
meeting.
that would have assumed he would have mentioned it, Chairman. Thank you.
I'm afraid we can't cover what the Mayor hasn't said. We have to cover what he has said. Assembly Member Polanski.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, I wanted to bring us back to COP, and I agree on the scale of the challenge. And world leaders too often haven't stepped to the challenge, particularly on finance. I was at COP and working really hard, but I want to acknowledge how hard you were working at COP. Everywhere I went, you seemed to be here, there and everywhere, particularly in your role as chair of the C40. And it struck me how much people are looking to London for that leadership role on the global stage. Now, you have a net zero pathway modelling tool that shows how we're going to get there specifically by 2050. You've now updated it quite rightly to 2030. When will we see that modelling change?
Which I've got to put on record, the collaboration with Green members over the last 5 years, in fact, sometimes critical friends, but always allies on this journey. In the next couple of months, we expect to publish it. We're working on it. We have been working on it very hard. I mean, you'll appreciate the environment team has a limited bandwidth. They've been trying to do a number of things, particularly in advance of Glasgow. Now Glasgow's out of the way. They're working full steam ahead. I probably shouldn't say that. They're working really hard to make sure we get this done, and as soon as it's done, we'll make sure we share with the colleagues. And we really want to, as you said, set a template for how other cities and other countries can follow.
Absolutely. The key theme of COP was about transparency, particularly on the global stage, so we can track how countries are doing with their NDCs. How confident are you that we're giving enough detail to Londoners so they can scrutinise those plans and essentially hold you accountable?
One of the things we want to do is, look, there's a lot of pressure on national governments, and I want to put on record my thanks to Alok Sharma for his leadership over the last period as President. And I want our national government to be leading the way for other governments to follow. But I want our government to have a route into transparency in relation to how they can have a Green New Deal and make what is a big challenge into a solution. And I want London to be an exemplar. And so when it comes to transparency in relation to what we're doing, it's really important we show the government how it can be done. And actually transparency leads to better decision making, I think, because it means everyone knows what the state of play is. And sometimes challenge from outside organisations, outside government, outside City Hall, outside the mayoral office is a good thing, because we want to raise our game. Look, this is an issue we're all on the same side, right? We all agree in the ends. We may differ on the means or the pace of the means, but I think all of us want to go as fast as we can. And I think the more transparent we are, the better energy there'll be. And you'll have experienced the energy from outside the national politicians, NGOs, civic society, young people, faith leaders, the business community, mayors, council leaders, and so forth. And if that can help us go even further and faster, I'm all for it.
I agree. I think when you left the ring of steel, so to speak, and you met those young people out in the streets, that's where the hope is. And I was really pleased to hear you say that London are a city of doers. Essentially, London's where the hope is, with those NGOs and people on the streets. One day I went out batting for London with the media, essentially talking about some of your good ideas, and some of our good ideas too that you've co-opted and I've been pleased to see. I was incredulous one morning though during COP when you were encouraging the Grand Prix to happen in London. We know from Car Free Day what that does to levels of air pollution. It massively reduces the toxicity in the air. What do you think cars doing about 17 laps around the racecourse will do to air pollution in London?
Well, I'm surprised you're not aware of the technological advances that F1 has generated. I mean, it's like when you send a person to the moon. The benefits weren't just to that person going to the moon and you know, discovering things outside of our planet, but it's also in relation to the advances in technology that led to other innovation taking place in our kitchens, in our front rooms, and in our homes. Now, we've now got Formula E in London. When I first encouraged Formula E to stay in London, there were concerns around Formula E. There's lots of criticism from people who didn't understand what Formula E was about. Some of the technology in Formula One has been really exciting around, brake pads, around tyre technology, around what they're doing around innovations around fuel consumption and so forth. I'm quite clear that we've got to make sure if F1 was to come to London, it's got to be as environmentally friendly as possible. I'm also quite clear that in relation to our role as a city, we want to be a global leader. We want the whole world to understand that we are the greatest city in the world. One of the ways we do that is by showcasing sporting events, whether it's boxing, whether it's tennis, or whether it's football. Next year we've got the Women's Euros taking place with the final in London and other examples as well. And we're not saying take F1 away from Silverstone. I think it's really important for it to be in Silverstone. But I think there are opportunities for our city.
I think that the idea of electric cars, the tyres we still know are particularly bad with the particulates. I take what you say about new technologies, but I think we're at risk of sounding like we're full of blah, 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 because I don't think we can just hope for new technology to come. I think when we make these decisions, we need to look at where we're at now. But can I just ask you one more final question, which I think we'll be able to reach consensus on more easily? On the issue of global solidarity that happened at COP, a French presidential hopeful is visiting London tomorrow. This person is on the far right. They've been prosecuted twice for hate crime, including inciting racial hatred. Will you make it really clear they're not welcome in London?
No, I'm quite clear. One of the things that I've said is the strength of our city is our diversity. And I spent the last 5 years trying to bring people together. Dare I say, building bridges and not walls. Nobody who wants to divide our communities or incite hatred against people because of the colour of their skin or the God they worship is welcome in our city.
Thank you very much. No further questions.
Thank you very much. Can I just, I'd just like now to welcome to the public gallery St Michael's Catholic Church, Bermondsey. There's some students from there, and also the young people from the Tooting and Mitcham United Football Club, who apparently are here today to observe. You're all very welcome to see how London's democracy works. We now move on to Assembly Member Baker, if please.
Sorry,
I feel I've had the floor stolen from me by the Tooting football players. I'd like to ask a couple of follow-up questions around the very, very serious situation that you've outlined in regards to Transport for London this morning. And in your update, and as we've seen in the press this morning and TfL papers, bus services potentially could be cut by almost a fifth without a sustainable funding settlement for government. We know that low-income Londoners, working-class Londoners, are more likely to use the bus, much more likely to use the bus, along with women, BAME Londoners, our youngest and our oldest people in our city, all use the bus much more frequently. What would this lack of funding do for London, the impact on social impact and inclusion in our city, which you've talked about just now?
Well, it's serious. I mean, the reason why we're talking about this today is because TfL has a Finance Committee meeting next week. This is the time of year where they've got to prepare the budget for next year, and they've published papers today which are scary. They show that because of Londoners doing the right thing and not using public transport as they were advised, dare I say, told to do by the government, our fares revenue plummeted. We need fares revenue to pay for our services, and without government support, we can't provide those services. The government has given support to train operating companies around the country. We welcome that. They've given support to businesses. We welcome that. They've not given us the support and certainty we need going forward. They have up until December. They haven't given us short-term deals. We welcome that. But it's now 3 weeks to go, and we've got to balance the books. And one way we balance the books is by cutting services. If there's no money coming in, you've got to reduce the services. It will mean some bus routes that poor Londoners need, often changing once, twice, 3 times to get from home to work, could be lost. It means the frequency of tube services will be reduced at a time we're trying to encourage people back to the office, and at a time where our country needs London firing on all cylinders. It's nonsensical to me on an economic basis, but you're right to remind everyone else it's also nonsensical on a social and moral basis, because the poorest people, the poorest families, will suffer the worst consequences of the cuts we have to do because of a lack of support from central government.
Thank you. And just to dig into that a little bit more about one particular set of Londoners, if the transport network becomes much more run down because the government refused to provide the funding needed to recover from the pandemic, what will this mean regards to ensure the network remains safe and staffed, particularly for the safety of women, which we've talked about so much rightly over the past few months, and with regards to services at night?
Well, one of the things that I did when I first became mayor was to reverse the decision made by the previous mayor to cut hundreds of staff who worked on the underground in our stations. It was important not just for the safety of women and girls who use public transport, but it's a really important service that they provide working there. They're not simply there to provide reassurance, they do a really important role as well. One of the things we'll have to look into is what are the ways we can reduce the TfL bill in relation to reducing services, means staff being lost, but also potentially staff on the underground and elsewhere where we know many Londoners, particularly women and girls, don't feel safe using those public services. As I said, there's 3 weeks to go until the money the government's given us finishes. We've got a number of months before this year ends. We've agreed with the government, by the way, as they asked us to do so, from 2023 to be completely financially sustainable. Unlike any transport authority in the world, the issue is what happens between now and 2023, and there's also nothing from the government in relation to capital investments, which deals with your point about safety. It isn't simply that we haven't got money for Crossrail 2 or the Baker Line extension. We're concerned about renewals and safety. You'll know the problems with the council-owned bridge in Hammersmith. There are other things that we're responsible for, the Westway, the Rother High Tunnel, where there are concerns about lack of support from the government, leading to more closures of those roads and those tunnels because we can't guarantee safety.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Let's all hope that we see some movement over the next few weeks from the government. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Best.
Chair, good morning, Mr Mayor, and thank you for your update. At last Mayor's question time, I told you how vital reopening the night tube was, and we were in agreement there, and as well how important it is for those 150,000 that signed that petition asking for the reopening of the night tube, because too many women and girls have witnessed or experienced sexual harassment at night travelling home and really need that safe haven transport. If I'm correct, can I sum up what I took from your remarks, and you can confirm if correct, that the night tube will reopen on Saturday the 27th, but at possibly at reduced levels of service?
That is a concern we have, because obviously if there are some of the drivers who are striking, by the way, other trade unions aren't striking, that means there are few operators to drive the services. So it could be, you're spot on, there could be, rather than one tube every X minutes, it's one tube every X plus 4 minutes.
Thank you for clarifying. A second question, Mr Mayor, is if you would agree with me that the irresponsible threats of the union, RMT union, will worry vulnerable Londoners and put our economy at risk over Christmas?
Well, the good news is there's some time between now and the night tube opening. That's why I implore, and I hope you join me in imploring everyone to get around a table and let's resolve this, because where I agree with you is the nighttime economy has had a real kick in the last 18 months. And one of the great things about the night tube is, particularly on Friday night and Saturday night, it gives people confidence returning home after a great night out in London. And you'll have seen the fantastic announcement this week with the lights in central London, with a variety of activities happening this Christmas. And we as a city need this recovery. And so I'd ask everyone to pull together to make sure the night tube does reopen, the night overground does reopen with the full services we can offer, rather than a reduced service because the RMT are on strike.
Thank you. And finally, last week at our plenary, Assembly members cross-party agreed to ask you to set out a clear timetable on when the 3 remaining lines will reopen, because 2 out of 5 lines isn't enough, and we don't want to leave Londoners in the dark anymore about when those other lines will return. Are you able to set out that timetable? Yeah,
I'm sure we can, Chair. There's no secret to this. What it is, it's the speed with which we can train new drivers, operators, to get through the system. Just to remind colleagues, I know you're on top of this, but other colleagues, the issue is those train operators who left or have gone to other parts of TfL trying to backfill in relation to new people being train operators. We couldn't train them during the pandemic because of the social proximity rules. We now can, and so it's all systems go. And so as soon as we can, we'll get them going. I've said to TfL, if we have train operators trained for line A, just say Jubilee line, let's get that going. rather than waiting for the other two lines, Northern and Piccadilly as well. I just said Jubilee first, but there could be either one of the other two. Let's not wait for all three to be full systems go. If one can go, let's get that one going as well. And I'm more than happy, Assembly Member, to ask TfL to get in touch with the plenary colleagues and through the chair to let colleagues know what the line is, because I think that people knowing, businesses knowing in advance can help them plan as well. So there's no downside to transparency there.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. We now move to the remaining questions on the priority order paper. Each group is allocated an amount of time to ask their questions that is proportionate to their size. The first question today is it concerns the London Living Wage Week, and that's in the name of Assembly Member Ahmad.
Thank you, Chair. Can I thank the member for her question, particularly pertinent this week. The 20th anniversary of Living Wage Week is well worth celebrating across the United Kingdom and especially in London. This week I announced the new London Living Wage rate of £11.05 an hour. The number of London Living Wage employers has quadrupled since I was elected in 2016. I'm proud that over 2,400 of the country's 9,000 accredited living wage employers are based in London, where the campaign began 20 years ago. This growth is testament to the efforts of so many workers, community groups and employers. The London Living Wage is making a profound contribution to the standard of living and well-being of thousands of Londoners and their families. Over 100,000 Londoners received a pay rise when the new rate was announced this week. Living wage employers report they're able to attract, recruit and retain the best talent, and that their employees are happier and more productive at work. Paying the living wage makes good business sense. I've put the living wage at the heart of my good work standard, which sets the benchmark for good employment practice in London. Over 235,000 Londoners work for our 100 accredited good work standard employers covering sectors as diverse as retail, construction, transport, health, local government, media, charities, law and finance. They all recognise that good work starts with fair pay. Despite these successes, we still, though, have a long way to go. 1 in 5 jobs in London pays less than the living wage, so we need to get out there and make the case for more employers to sign up. This week, I also announced London's plans to become a living wage city, reaffirming the pledge I made when I was re-elected. This new campaign will bring together London's communities, employers, trade unions and workers to solve London's biggest pay challenges. The first campaign steering group is meeting in the new year. I'm calling on all organisations to play their part, especially those in the sectors that are pivotal to our recovery from the COVID pandemic, like retail, hospitality, the nighttime economy, health and social care.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and I know that many people, including those in my own constituency of Lambeth and Southwark, are delighted with the announcement that you've made. The government announced a pay increase to the national minimum wage to £9.50, which falls considerably short of what you've announced. This comes on top of the cut to the universal credit uplift, which leaves many Londoners struggling to make ends meet. There was nothing in the recent budget for those who cannot work. That includes carers, those with young children and people who are sick or disabled, who face the same costs and pressures as other households and will still have a black hole in their finances after the universal credit cut. What support can you provide to these Londoners in the absence of government action?
Well, just to remind you that the difference between somebody from next April receiving the government's minimum wage and those receiving the London Living Wage in London is £4,000 a year. That's the difference it makes to an individual. What we're trying to do is, look, being honest, we can't fill the massive hole left by government cuts to welfare benefits, to the increase in national insurance from next year, to welfare benefit caps, to the increased cost of living. What we can do, though, is using our limited resources, help Londoners in relation to heating up their homes. So we've got a warmer homes programme, which is trying to help Londoners reduce their energy bills. We've also got a advice in the community settings programme, which is helping people with debt. What we don't want people to be doing is getting into debt through loan sharks and those who charge high interest rates. So we're giving advice on debts. And the third really important piece of work, particularly as the weather gets colder, is the Life Off the Streets programme, helping rough sleepers. You'll be aware from your constituents, some people can, because of the increased cost of living, lose their homes and become rough sleepers. We want to get them off the streets as soon as possible. And that's one example of the things we're doing this winter.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Very welcome initiatives. Just following on from this, what impact will the budget have on the cost of living for Londoners?
Well, unfortunately, the universal credit cut of £20 a week still took place, and the announcement from the Chancellor about the tapered relief doesn't help as many Londoners as need the help. We're really concerned about the increase in inflation. You've seen the figures this week about inflation going up even further, which means a real cost of living crisis with wages not meeting the increased costs of living. The government has announced, which I welcome, a hardship fund. It's £500 million. Again, it doesn't fill the hole left by the consequences of some of their policies. We'll have to wait and see the detail of how the spending review plays out into each department and stuff, but I'm concerned about austerity continuing, even though we were led to believe that austerity would come to an end with the election of this government in November 2019.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. The Chancellor acknowledged every child's right to succeed, but as you know, we have high child poverty levels in London, and this budget left too much still left to do. It's good to see that the Chancellor acknowledged that 10 years of austerity has had an adverse impact on children's start in life. What conversations are you having with the Chancellor to lobby for family hubs that have been announced to be set up in London?
Sorry, I didn't hear the last bit. For what? The last bit.
What conversations are you having with the Chancellor to lobby for the family hubs that have been announced to be set up in London?
Well, so far, no good news in relation to money from the Treasury in relation to the family hubs. We are hoping to meet with the newish Secretary of State for Education to discuss this issue. We are doing some work in relation, you'll be aware, with colleagues across London with the London Recovery Programme. And one of the people involved are the ANC institutions, the NHS, and other key colleagues. So we are working with other colleagues across London. No support up until now from the government about the family hub. And we know from the early years work we've done, the early years hubs, the early years campaigns, how much of a game changer they can be for families who didn't know of some of the facilities and on offer. And it's particularly relevant this winter as we approach not just the colder weather, more energy bills, the potential increase in food prices as well. And that's why it's really important these poorer families receive the support they need.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. The next question is about tackling air pollution in London, and it's in the name of Assembly Member Bukhari.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for the question. I've made London's environment a top priority, and as a result, our city now leads the world on tackling air pollution and climate change. But there's no room for complacency. Fine particulate matter, PM2.5, is the pollutant most harmful to human health, and air pollution remains the biggest environmental health issue in London. In my environment strategy, I set out a target to achieve the now interim WHO recommended target of 10 micrograms per metre cubed for PM2.5 by 2030. Analysis by King's College London, published in October 2019, showed that through my policies and with additional powers and funding, it's possible for London to meet my target, which is well above the government's own targets nationally. We've already made good progress. Since 2016, my policies have led to a 15% reduction in PM2.5 London-wide. Road transport is the largest individual source of local PM2.5 emissions, and the Central London ULEZ contributed to a 27% drop in PM2.5 concentrations in the zone in just 2 years. Over the same period, PM2.5 concentrations remained flat nationally. The recent expansion of the ULEZ to the north and south circular roads, which was opposed by many in this Assembly, is expected to help reduce road transport exhaust emissions across London. But this is not a foregone conclusion. We're working hard to make this expansion a success. I'm continuing to invest in cleaning up the bus and taxi fleets and making it easier and safer for people to walk and cycle. And I've used the limited powers I have to tackle non-transport emissions, including through the London-wide non-road mobile machinery low emission zone and new air quality guidelines in the London plan. But I don't have the powers I need to tackle all non-transport sources of PM2.5, which account for around 70% of local emissions, including wood burning and commercial cooking. Much of the PM2.5 measured in London actually comes from sources outside the city, meaning national and European action is needed.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you for mentioning the wood burning issue. One major form of particulate pollution is from wood burning stoves. It's not visible to the naked eye and quite dangerous. Both short and long-term exposure to PM 2.5 increases the risk of early death from respiratory and cardiovascular diseases, as well as increased hospital admissions. What plans do you have for raising awareness of this particular issue amongst Londoners? And are you committed to a proper awareness campaign with a real budget for communication?
So we've been working with local boroughs in relation to what we can do in relation to this issue. We've lobbied the government unsuccessfully for more powers around this issue, including tighter emission standards, stronger enforcement powers, and minimum emission standards for new wood-burning stoves without success. So what we've done instead is, as the member alludes to, is do what we can to raise awareness. So we're working with Impact on Urban Health and Cantor on research around this area of wood burning. We've also worked with Cantor, who've developed several platform options to test what works in terms of messaging. And this will be tested with focus groups before developing, as has been suggested, a toolkit for communications around wood burning. And we've also supported a multi-borough application to the DEFRA Air Quality Grants Programme, which is focused on quantifying the emissions from different types of wood burning and raising awareness of the impact of wood burning. And if successful, the research element of the project would start in April, with the dedicated campaign with 15 boroughs starting the following year, which that will be informed from the findings of the Cantor work.
So that's great news about the lobbying, but we need some money now, and you did invest £20,000 back in 2018 with an industry information campaign encouraging people who currently use an open fire to switch to a cleaner, eco-design ready wood burning stove. That was welcome, but that was over 3 years ago, and we do need some more money now. That was nothing compared to what we really have in front of us, a massive task. Will you be able to write to me with just some serious initiatives that you plan to take up and tackle this growing issue, particularly when it comes to that budget?
Well, the reason why the industry work was so important is they make the kit that's leading to the particular matter coming out, and if they have cleaner kit with the right wood burning material, that'll obviously lead to less particulate matter. So that was really important. As I said in my answer, we have applied to DEFRA for grant money to do more work going forward, but I'm more than happy to write to the member in relation to this work that we're doing, and if she's got any idea of more monies we can be applying for or receiving, more than happy to listen to ideas that she may have.
Thank you. And given the fact that you're now the chair of C40Cities, a global network of 100 cities working to address climate change, which is a powerful role and a significant responsibility during the climate emergency, and given the fact that eco wood-burning stoves on average emit 750 times more particulate matter than a modern truck exhaust, will you be willing to raise this issue, not just here in London, but on a global stage?
With respect, I think in the global south, wood burning is a matter of necessity, and we've got to work with them in relation to giving them the finances they need around resilience, adaptation, and support. And when you think of the challenges, particularly the cities in the global south face, we've got particular issues, and I think Zach raised the issue about how COP26 had let down some of those countries with the lack of the national determined targets they've got. We are doing lots of work on the C40. Air pollution is one of them. One of them works which I announced 2 weeks ago was around Breathe Global, using some of the lessons from Breathe London to try and improve air quality around the world. And that includes particulate matter, and wood burning is one of the causes of particulate matter as well. But there are a whole host of issues which we're going to deal with on the C40 network, and air quality is clearly one of them.
Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Pigeon.
Thank you very much. Mr Mayor, a year ago I asked a written question about particulate pollution monitoring on the approach roads to the Silvertown Tunnel and received a vague reply about 4 months later. I wrote to you again back in June, but I've not yet had a response. Where precisely will you be monitoring particulate matter on the approach roads to your tunnel?
I think they've already started. So there are several sites in Tower Hamlets, in Greenwich, There are several sites that also do nitrogen dioxide as well. I think there's a site in Britannia Gate. I'd like to apologise for not responding to your letter in June. Can I look into that and make sure you get a proper response?
I'd be grateful to get those details.
That shouldn't be happening.
Thank you. Another way to tackle air pollution and particulate matter is through your scrappage schemes. A scheme currently being run by Transport for West Midlands has seen nearly 300 people in Coventry show an interest in giving up their cars in exchange for mobility credits. Even at this sort of late stage of your vehicle scrappage schemes, will you look again at how mobility credits could be adopted, helping people to use public transport, join a car club, perhaps buy a bike, not just replacing one vehicle with another?
Pigeon's question much later on.
And I've linked it to air pollution very clearly, so I'm coming in off the back.
Her question is about scrappage. I mean, she's just bringing.
It's about air pollution, as I said.
This is about air pollution, and I believe there's.
I've linked it very clearly.
Well, Chair, the member Parade in Aid, West Midlands, scrapping 300 cars. Was that the figure?
No, I was saying that the public had expressed interest in this idea of moving to mobility credits, and was that something you might consider? Even at this stage with your vehicle scrappage scheme?
The figure you used was 300 cars was scrapped in West Midlands, was the figure you used. In London, the figure isn't 300, I'm afraid. The figure is 12,900 vehicles have been scrapped. And if West Midlands want to speak to us, as they are, about good ideas from us, we're always happy to speak to West Midlands. Of the 12,900 polluting vehicles that have been taken off our roads, 7,600 are cars, a bit more than 300, 5,200 vans and minibuses, and over 120 HGVs and coaches from our roads, and a further 18 heavy vehicles have also been retrofitted via the scheme. If it's the case that our lobbying of the government proves successful and the government does accede to have a national diesel scrappage scheme, I think it's really important we learn from other great cities like Birmingham and the West Midlands about what's worked with them, and if the credit scheme has proved to be successful, we're more than happy to learn from West Midlands. I met Andy Street, the Mayor of West Midlands, this week, and one of the points I made to him is, if there's things they're doing that are good, that are working, we've got to learn from them. And so if there is a next generation of scrappage schemes, let's learn the best ideas, not just from Birmingham, Bath and Portsmouth may have good ideas as well. All three, of course, benefit from central government money, something London doesn't.
Yeah, no, you rightly highlight that London's been excluded from some of these national funding pots that would tackle air pollution, and at the same time I know you have put in £61 million to fund vehicle scrappage schemes, but I recently discussed mobility credits with TfL's commissioner, and he was very interested in this initiative. So whilst I understand but regret that mobility credits have not been built into your current scrappage schemes, and I welcome the number of vehicles, of course, that have come off our streets that are polluting. Will you agree to look at how this could be used in the future going forward to reduce air pollution and to support cleaner forms of travel in our city?
Well, I think there's the horse and the cart. It's got to be the right order, and the right order is getting the money from the government first to have a scrappage scheme and then getting the right policies in place. But it is important we learn from other cities. One of the reasons we're particularly pleased there are now 3 cities, in addition to London, having clean air zones, is we can see what works. And one of the downsides of being world leading is you're the first one to do it, and you really are trying out new things. Some work really well, some can be tinkered, some don't work. And I think the ideas you've got about looking at what works is one that we agree with, and I'm pleased the Commissioner said what he did. I didn't realise he said that. That's really reassuring, which confirms what I've said. If things work, let's use them.
Yeah. I just think at this stage, having an initial piece of work done to look at what could work, so that if something does become available for government, I realise that's a big if when it comes to London, you're ready with the shovel-ready scheme. So I was just hoping you might commit to a little piece of work to progress this. Yeah, is that a yes?
Once we've got some certainty of money, if the government gives, unless you know there's money coming.
No, I did say there was an if, but I'm just suggesting to you that perhaps do a little bit of work on this, so you're ready to go if there is suddenly money you could bid for.
Can I reassure you, if the government wants to give us money, it won't be overnight. There'll be plenty of time between the government announcing money, the government giving us the money for us to work out a scheme. And if you're saying there's a ready scheme working in the West Midlands, which we can take off the shelf, even less time required.
Okay, thank you. I welcome that commitment. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Assembly Member Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. We discussed a motion concerning particulate pollution at the plenary just last week, and I put an amendment down to the motion that came from the Assembly Member opposite. You have run an awareness campaign, but we do still have this issue about wood-burning stoves, and of course the enforcement is mainly with local authorities. You've mentioned the issue of powers. So I wanted to ask you two things. I think one of the particular issues with wood-burning stoves is if people use wet wood, and actually that was apparent when I went to Battersea Park recently and saw the bonfire when it started. It was absolutely unbelievable, the smoke coming out because the wood was soaking wet, and a number of constituents wondered if there was actually something very toxic in the smoke, but I think it was just the wood was wet, so I did inquire. So that is a real issue, and I wondered, is there an awareness campaign that could be done by City Hall and by local authorities together as we go into the colder winter season? And then I just wondered, is there any update at all about the Clean Air Act and any funding through the Clean Air Fund? Your scrappage scheme, 61 million, the government's Clean Air Fund, 200 million, but nationwide. I mean, it's not really enough, is it? Is there any news on them doing anything serious about that? Because we have just hosted COP, and this is a big area for us.
No, thank you for your questions. No good news in relation to additional funding, which is required. There's got to be funding. Without funding, it doesn't work. I mean, even it's been suggested having marketing campaigns or raising awareness campaigns. I'm afraid that requires resources. The GLA's environment team work incredibly hard. It's a small team. They punch well above their weight as a city, but also when you look across the globe. And to suggest we can get even more out of them, I think it's not realistic, but we'll try to do what we can. One of the things the government did do in relation to the issue that you raise is new regulations. But by itself, new regulations without the awareness doesn't work. So we're working with London councils to try and get retailers to give bad information to customers when they're buying things from them, but also to raise the awareness about the downsides of burning wet wood. And working with council, we're trying to do what we can, but even councils have limited resources, and we've got to be realistic about the consequences of the cuts we're facing. I think this is a, inverted commas, lost leader though, because by spending now, if the government will give us the resources, will save people getting unwell, going to hospital, taking time off work, and so forth. So you get back what you invest in relation to this, and 70% of the particular matter in the air is caused by the issues you're talking about. That's why it's so important. We do what we can with transport, but we need support with this.
Well, seeing the queues outside some A&Es for ambulances, I think this is quite urgent. But thank you, Chair.
Thank you. The next question concerns manifesto commitments, and that's in the name of Assembly Member Hall.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for the question. Since my re-election in May, my team and I have made good progress on delivering on my manifesto commitments. Only a few months into my second term, we've already launched London's biggest ever domestic tourism campaign to get the central London economy moving again, committed over £32 million of funding for new skills academies to help Londoners take advantage of job opportunities in key growth areas, expanded the world-leading ultra-low emission zone to an area 18 times the size of the original central zone, agreed a new £3.46 billion deal with the government to build more genuinely affordable housing, secured £10 million of investment to help deliver interventions for up to 2,500 children and young people at the greatest risk of serious violence, invested nearly £2 million to help young Londoners exit criminal gangs, invested £150,000 in a new programme to support Londoners under pressure, London's under pressure nurseries and childminders, announced a retrofit revolution in a partnership deal worth up to £10 billion to deliver large-scale low-carbon upgrades to our city's social housing, cutting carbon while supporting the creation of green jobs, invested £6 million to create and improve green spaces as part of London Climate Action Week, and the list goes on. My manifesto is an ambitious plan for a brighter future and is targeted specifically to address the scale of the challenges our city faces at this unique point in its history, from the climate emergency to the urgent need to rebuild our economy after the pandemic. The manifesto commitments include actions for the GLA and the functional bodies, and in areas where the powers are not devolved or we currently receive insufficient funding, issues we plan to lobby the government on. We've been working hard to build bridges across party lines both within London and with the national government to get the best for our city. My manifesto is aimed at delivering a safer, greener, fairer and more prosperous city.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Actually, I wasn't going to ask you about those manifesto pledges. You made lots. In your 2021 manifesto, you made commitments about transparency or being transparent 5 times. You also said last year that you were, and I quote, proud to be the most open and transparent Mayor of London ever. So do you think you're delivering on that commitment?
I do, Chair. And if you look at the number of FOIs, we answer more than any mayor over an 8-year period in just 5 years. When you look at the number of mayor's question times, plenary sessions, assembly meetings I go to, when you look at the number of people's question times, events I do where I take questions from members of the public, far more transparent than any mayor in the history of this great city, and I'll carry on doing so as long as I'm mayor.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because actually you say it very often, so if you say things often enough, people tend to think you're correct. But at the last meeting of the audit panel, Internal Audit brought the most recent review of public correspondence report for us to consider, and it showed that the Mayor's team had only 44, 43 and 50% of responses being within the 2-week statutory deadline for the months May, April and March, respectively. Now, this compares to a target of 90%. And in fact, it was noted that the Mayor's office was, and I quote, the worst performing directorate for public correspondence. So with this in mind, can you possibly say that you're the most transparent Mayor ever? And will you admit that you're failing in your commitments to be transparent?
I can say it, I do say it, and I am. There's a number of things you can point to. Look at the number of FOIs we respond to.
I'm not talking about FOIs, I'm talking about correspondence, Mr. Mayor.
In record time, and it's interesting that the member looks towards a comparator during a pandemic to try and find examples of bad practice. The reality is, in the 5 years plus I've been mayor, we have provided more information in speedier time.
That's not correct.
Chair, I've got to be able to answer the question. I mean, it's either mayor's question time or assembly members' perorations.
Shall we go on to a different manifesto?
Assembly member.
Oh, sorry, is he still telling you
reply?
Untruths, yeah. Shall I go on to something else that you might prefer, Mr. Mayor?
So for
in your manifesto,
for those young people watching, not all politicians are rude, like Assembly Member Susan Hall. Some are very polite and courteous.
and some answer questions, everybody in the audience. So the next question, let's have a bash.
Mr. Mayor, I think those personal comments are uncalled for. Would you like to reply to your first question, Assembly Member? The Mayor must be able to reply to your question.
Well, Chair, there is analysis which shows that we are more transparent than any of the previous 2 mayors. There is analysis that shows we respond more speedily than any of the previous 2 mayors, but also analysis that shows we receive far more volumes than any of the previous 2 mayors. When it comes to percentages, what it hides is the vast volumes, and in aggregate numbers, the responses are far greater from my team. And we'll carry on being transparent. It's really important Londoners have confidence in the process, but also in speedy responses.
Just for information, the mayoral team only had 3.5% of all requests, so you can't blame the lateness of responding on that. So I think I'll go on to something different. In your manifesto, Mr. Mayor, you promised to review how to further involve local communities in the planning decisions that affect them. And that's a quote. Do you think that building inappropriate tower blocks on TfL station car parks against the wishes of thousands of local residents and 3 local planning committees so far is a good example of involving local communities in planning decisions that affect them?
Well, let me give you examples, Chair, of what we've done to address the issue of engagement that's been referred to in the question asked by the member, which is community engagement in planning. We have a community engagement handbook which has been produced by me since I became Mayor, which is on the principles of community engagement, and the principles are currently being fed through into the work the planning team are undertaking. We also have, since I've been elected Mayor, community engagement on call-ins. We've committed to continue to hold hybrid meetings for call-ins. I held the first ever one, to enable more people to participate in the process, and this experience post-Manifesto it shows that our approach is already enabling more people to engage. Officers are currently working on an enhanced engagement strategy to supplement statutory consultation, so over and above what we're required to do. Additionally, I was asked the question, we have community engagement as part of plan making. So we carried out a significant engagement programme to involve a broad range of Londoners in the development of London Plan, more than any other mayor in the history of our city. Another example of engagement, which was the question asked by the member in relation to planning. And this included significant numbers of community events and panels, as well as more traditional consultation. And we are indeed undertaking bespoke approaches to engagement on the London Plan guidance. Another example of the innovation. Well, Chair, she may not like it, but she asked the question and I'm giving the answer.
She asked the question quite
Chair,
so, but equally she is on a timer here, as you well know.
I can either be allowed to answer the question or you can allow the member to interrupt.
You can rattle on all you like. I will then say to you, you can engage if you like, but actually what you should be doing,
Chair,
Mr Mayor, is listening
Chair,
to what the residents
Chair, you
are
must
saying
be
to
impartial.
you.
Chair, I know she's your leader, you must be impartial.
Can we get an answer?
Well, I was answering and you interrupted. Can I answer now?
Perhaps you could be a bit more concise with your answer.
Chair, it's not for you to tell me how long I can answer for.
Actually, it is.
Well, no.
If you could.
Yeah. Know your place, Mr Mayor, know your place.
It's Mayor's question time. It's not Tory question time, Chair, it's Mayor's question time. Another example of engagement, which is what I was asked about, was our digital platforms. The planning team have led the way on using different digital platforms to engage with communities, which was the question asked by the member. The problem is there are too many examples of our engagement. I'll give you another example of engagement.
No, I don't need any more examples. Please, with respect, I'm on a timer. The point is, you may want to engage with people, but the idea is that you listen to them. You don't ask them a question and then take no regard of their answer whatsoever. You have got thousands and thousands of people that have signed against development on TfL land. In fact, the excellent MP... In fact, the excellent MP, Teresa Villiers, has just handed in a petition of another 2,627 signatures against the High Barnet development. Thousands and thousands of people do not want these developments. It's no good saying you've asked them if you're not listening to the answers. Will you listen to these people? So you also pledged in your manifesto to oppose tall buildings. Well, I'm saying listen to the... Are you going to tell all these people that you will listen to them?
And the Chair's got to be impartial, but he's not, clearly.
No, wait, that's always... No, I'm speaking on behalf of lots of residents, Mr Mayor. And you're not involved in this at all, Assembly.
Andrew, this is beneath you, Andrew. Andrew, it's beneath you.
Can we get a question?
OK, the next question. You also pledged in your manifesto to oppose tall buildings that, and I'm quoting here, that don't enhance London's skyline or which provide little social or economic benefit. So do you think building tower blocks that harm conservation areas, listed buildings and listed parks, as TfL is proposing at places such as Stanmore, Cannons Park, Arnos Grove and Cockfosters, is a good example of social or economic benefit? Well, why don't you listen and you'll pick up the question? Do you think it's a good example of social or economic benefits? Question mark.
Sorry, Chair. In the fourth minute of the question, I lost train of what was being said. Can she repeat that?
Oh, and that is the way not to answer questions, because it's not answering. OK, let's try something else, because this is... Let's try something else, Mr Mayor, because this is on everybody's mind, even people opposite. There are many local concerns about the impact of removal commuter parking on the safety of female and vulnerable transport users. particularly late at night. Do you agree that nothing should be done by TfL or any other GLA body that puts people at risk? And will you therefore agree to review TfL's development schemes on this basis?
Well, Chair, all TfL schemes that go to a planning committee and a council are properly considered by the officers. There's a proper consultation, and the officers make a recommendation to the councillors on the planning committee. In relation to TfL sites that are surplus to TfL's requirements, the government has now required TfL as part of the deal to make sure there's property development of those sites, and TfL will continue to accede to the requirements of the government deal to develop those properties surplus to TfL's requirements.
Your responsibility, Mr Mayor. TfL is being directed to do all this on station car parks. You have thousands of Londoners that are begging you not to do this. How many other station car parks do you intend to build on? And I say you because you are in charge of TfL.
Well, Chair, let me be quite clear, unapologetic. There is a chronic shortage of affordable housing in our city, not a chronic shortage of car parking spaces in our city. There is a crisis. There is a crisis when it comes to housing in our city, not a crisis when it comes to car park spaces next to tube stations in our city. And this was...
Can I ask the public gallery, please, can I ask the public gallery to not comment during the question and answer session, because it gets in the way of hearing what the response
Mr Mayor, you are complaining there is a decrease in fare money coming into TfL. It does not help when people can't drive and park at a station in order then to come into London using public transport, which every one of us wants people to do. I will leave it there because our time.
Sorry, Chair, was that a question? Because you've got a chair at some stage, Andrew.
I think it was a finish.
This is what he does when
It was a finish.
when he doesn't
Assembly
know
member,
the answer.
Sorry, Chair, was that a question? Chair, was that a question?
I don't think it was, but it was a finish. And Assembly Member Bailey.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor. How are you? In your manifesto on page 219, I believe it is, you pledge to work with the tourism sector to improve pay and conditions. Later on in the manifesto, in the nighttime economy, you say you want to make London a living wage economy. In the skills and employment section, as part of your good work recovery mission, you again talk about having more employers accredited to the good work standard. Even in the financial exclusion part of your manifesto, you make a pledge to promote credit unions to employees through businesses that are signed up to the good work standard. Do you run the risk of failing to deliver on these pledges because the good work standard is not signed up to by a lot of businesses?
Well, Chair, can I commend the member for reading the manifesto that I stood on, and I got a record return from Londoners. No mayor has ever received more votes than I did in May standing on that manifesto. I'm pleased that you read the manifesto. I'm afraid I can't give you the same courtesy of having read your manifesto. What I can say is the announcement this week of the London living wage going up to £11.05, which gave overnight 100,000 Londoners a pay rise, is one I'm incredibly proud of. I'm also incredibly proud that 30 of the employers we spoke to who were interested in becoming a good work standard employer, in fact, weren't paying the London living wage. And because they spoke to us and worked with us, those 30 employers not only became good work standard employers, but started paying the London living wage, which has gone up from £10.85 an hour to £11.05 an hour. There are now more than 100 good work standard employers in the city that never existed before I became mayor, and that's an increase from 0 to more than 100. And now there are more than 230,000 Londoners employed by an employer who is a good work standard employer. And the benefits of them working for a good work standard employer is not simply in better terms and remuneration, but it's also in relation to trade union recognition, it's in relation to policies at work, and it's in relation to other things that take place in the workplace that benefits the productivity of that employer. And all the evidence we have, it's good employers not only lead to having better prospects of recruiting, better prospects at retaining their staff, but also better productivity, so they make more profits, so pay more taxes, which benefits all of us.
At the risk of
and what that is
sorry,
a virtual
can you answer
circle.
my question?
Well, Chair.
Sorry, Mr. Mayor, you've made a big thing about answering the question or giving a chance. Well, please do answer the question.
Chair, I'm asked a question about our policies, giving examples of a success, and the Tory doesn't like it.
No, what you're doing, Mr. Mayor, is not answering the question. You're answering the question you want to ask. The question was simple. Are you going to fail to deliver on these pledges because you haven't had enough people sign up to the Good Work Standard?
Well, Chair, I was going through some examples of those who signed up and the benefits, was interrupted, and you sat on your hands.
No, you were not answering the question. We all know that. We're aware that you don't want to answer the question, yes or no.
There was a clear question, Mr. Mayor. How you answer it is up to you.
Thank you.
There was a clear question.
I'm glad that's been clarified.
Yeah, it's up to you, but it didn't sound like you did answer it. But
well,
Mr. Mayor, maybe I'll give you another go. Why don't I give you another go?
So Chair, how's it going to work? How's it going to work?
The member is going to ask you a question.
Right, okay. And do I get a chance to answer it?
That's why you're here.
Great.
I would love you to answer it, Mr. Mayor. That would be great, but you're answering everything except the question you're being asked. So the Economy Committee in March 2020 asked you to come up with a strategy to get more businesses to sign on to the Good Work Standard. You refused to do that. So now you only have 100 employees. So you've gone from 0 to 100. But remember, there's 1.1 million businesses in London. So that's a tiny, tiny number. And before you say to me that it's about the number of employees each business has, you have maybe, 250,000 people signed up who are employees? But there's 5 million employees in London, not including the private sector, public sector, excuse me. So will you have a strategy to get more businesses to sign up to the Good Work Standard, yes or no?
Well, the problem, Chair, with the question is it's based on a false premise and a breathtaking amount of ignorance, which I've got to address in my answer. Otherwise, I can't do justice to Mayor's question time, which is the Mayor having a chance to answer questions asked by members of the Assembly. So the Good Work Standard was devised working with employees in London to make sure we got the employees' interest at heart, but also consulting workers and trade unions to make sure we got their interest at heart as well. And going from 0 employees being signed up to the Good Work Standard because there wasn't a Good Work Standard, to having a Good Work Standard and having now more than 100 is a fantastic achievement. We're going to carry on working with other employers to get more Good Work Standard employees signed up. There's good news in relation to the living wage increase this week. The other piece of good news is no Good Work Standard employer wants to resign and walk away from the Good Work Standard because of the increase in the London living wage, and will continue the progress of getting employees being Good Work Standard employees, naming and praising them, those that hire. And I can understand why some members on the Assembly are against good employees paying decent wages. I'm in favour of that, and I'd encourage more employees to sign up to the Good Work Standard.
So you didn't answer the question, and you then inferred that people are against the Good Work Standard. No, I never said anything about being against it. It's a good thing. What I'm talking about is your failure to deliver more than 4 of your election pledges, your manifesto pledges, because you refused to put in place a system that the Economy Committee asked for cross-party. And it's a simple question. Will you have a plan to get more employees to sign up and employers to sign up to the Good Work Standard, yes or no? We can all see you don't answer the question. Answer it or not. You're right, Assembly Member Cooper. It is ridiculous. If the Mayor answered the questions, we wouldn't be in this position. You're completely right. It is ridiculous.
When it comes to your,
Mr. Mayor.
When it comes to your time to ask a question, you can ask it in whichever way you want it. And there was a question. There was a question.
Absolutely was a question.
Clearly a question.
Chair, I'm going to stop there, but I want to put on record that the Mayor refused to answer the question. He just wasn't answering the question, and his members jumped to his rescue. Okay. Well, it's a fact. He sat there not answering the question. What can I do? Chair?
Assembly Member Rogers, if you'd like to come in now.
Draw us to one of your manifesto pledges that you have delivered, the expansion of the ULEZ zone. Are you able to tell us how many drivers have been charged so far since the zone expanded?
We'll have those figures in a month after the commitment, so probably around February 25th, November 25th, we'll have a better idea of the numbers of vehicles in the ULEZ expanded zone that were either compliant or non-compliant and so forth. A month's usually the right time. Those are rough figures. But if you go back to 19. It's a month after we had a better handle, because half term was when the scheme began. But we'd hope, Chair, to make them public then, and we'll share them with the Assembly clearly.
Thank you. And would you be able to tell us how many drivers have been issued with the penalty charge notice yet, or will that be with those figures as well?
Again, a very good question. So we'll have an idea a month afterwards about penalty charge notices, about compliance, non-compliance. We may even have, we did last time, an idea of any impacts on air quality. Those will be raw, but we may with a good wind be able to give those soon. But you need a minimum month time.
That'd be useful, thank you. At the previous Mayor's question time, you confirmed there's less than 2 million left in the car and motorcycle scrappage scheme. Are you able to update us on how much is left now?
Yeah, there is a figure, I'm afraid. I've got with me. I can do an email. Basically, there's those in the waiting list. The way it works with the scrappage scheme is you apply for the scrappage scheme, you then have 30 days to provide evidence that your car's been scrapped with the relevant company that scraps them, and you get then given the amount depending if it's what vehicle it is. And so sometimes those figures aren't. They can change, and if somebody doesn't put in their evidence, that money is available for somebody else. So we can give you an idea, but it won't be specific because there may be some changes. But I'm sure we can. Chair, I can email the member and give him an idea of what the figure is. That'd
be helpful. Thank you very much. And will you be investing any of the money raised by expanded ULEZ into further scrappage schemes?
I'm not sure if there is going to be net money raised. The cost of the ultra emission zone in relation to new cameras, in relation to raising awareness, in relation to the marketing, versus what we want ideally is vehicles to be compliant. I mean, the ultra emission zone is not a money raising policy. It's a air quality cleaning policy. So in an ideal world, there isn't going to be net monies raised. If there were net monies raised, I suspect that net monies raised would be needed to fill the massive black hole left by the pandemic. I mentioned at the opening of Mayor's Question Time the fact that our funding runs out in 3 weeks' time. I suspect there's money, in a hypothetical case, monies were raised in relation to any of our schemes. We'd cross-subsidise other parts of the public transport system.
Thank you. Our group, Disability Rights UK as well, has called for blue badge holders to be exempted from the ULEZ charge. Would you reconsider bringing this in?
So disabled vehicles, vehicles that are adapted, are exempt until 2025. The issue is those blue badge holders who drive vehicles that are not compliant, and I think there's more than 200,000 Londoners, I may have the figure slightly wrong, who've got blue badges. And they've been given some notice in relation to this. If you have a blue badge and your vehicle is compliant, clearly don't pay the ultra low emission zone. So what we're encouraging people to do is to, for the last 5 years, is to move over to a compliant vehicle. We're going to carry on the schemes in relation to disabled vehicles, those that have been adapted, black taxis, so forth, going forward. But that exemption doesn't apply for everyone who's got a blue badge.
So Inclusion London, it's actually 250,000 blue badge holders. Inclusion London has said that the ULEZ, expanded ULEZ zone will have a brutal impact on the ability of those 250,000 blue badge holders to access key services. We already have issues where disabled people find it difficult to get around the city. There's not enough step-free access. Chiswick, for example, my constituency, none of the stations that serve Chiswick are step-free. Do you accept that the expanded ULEZ zone will create another barrier for those blue badge holders to move around the city?
Well, it's worth reminding all of ourselves, those of us who are not disabled, that actually those who suffer the worst consequences of poor quality are often disabled people. They're poorer people, often don't own cars. When you speak to those who suffer respiratory issues in hospitals as inpatients, or even those as outpatients, many are disabled. And so this policy about cleaning up our air benefits disproportionately, not just those who are disabled, but those who are poorer, those who are black, Asian, minority, ethnic, those who live in outer London, in fact, as well benefit hugely from these policies. So I would argue that actually many of those blue badge holders benefit hugely from air being cleaner in our city. But also, you look at the savings for the NHS. The NHS will save billions of pounds over the next few years because of fewer people going to use outpatient or inpatient services because air's become cleaner. We know from the work done with the Central London ultra-low emission zone, huge improvements in air quality, improvements in life mortality, improvements in children not having to rely upon their pumps. Compared and contrast, to examples of children who suffer more adverse consequences of asthma, bronchitis, so forth, because of the poor quality air. So I'm hoping those Londoners concerned understandably understand in relation to additional costs on people will see the benefits of this world-leading policy.
Thank you. Just move on to another manifesto pledge. You promised to work with TfL to deliver a strategy for the suburbs. Could you give us an update on that and what your plans are with that, please?
Yeah, one of the things we're keen to do is to have more buses in outer London. Many parts of outer London don't have tube lines. And in central London, so if you think about the sea charge area, the sea charge area is about 1% of our city in relation to road usage, 1%. And in the sea charge area, it's possible to have alternatives to car usage, great tube, Elizabeth line opening next year. And so you can reduce the number of buses in that part of London because there are good alternatives, as well as walking, cycling, and so forth. We want those buses not to be cut permanently from London, but be moved to outer London. We've also noticed, you'll know this, but others may not realise this, but often the journey isn't from outer to central, it's outer to another town centre. It could be to a hospital, it could be to a college. And so it's new bus links going horizontally, if you like, rather than going vertically towards the centre. We've got examples of increasing bus services in frequency in outer London, examples of new bus routes in outer London. All that though will be undone if we've got to make the cuts that I referred to in answer to Ellie Baker's question about 18% cuts in our bus services. And that's why I'd hope colleagues from across the Assembly, across the political divide, would work with me to lobby the government as this money runs out in 3 weeks' time to get the monies we need to make sure people in your constituency and those in outer London can have a good public transport.
Do you have a timetable for this strategy? When are you hoping to publish it?
It's contingent on finances, and so what we don't want to do is do a strategy that we can't utilise because of the finances. And so the Finance Committee meets shortly to discuss the Finance Committee report. The monies from government, the temporary deal runs out on December the 11th. Depending on how long the money we get from the government, if it's another short-term deal, I suspect the strategy won't be forthcoming because we need a long-term deal to make sure the strategy can be funded. What would be the worst thing in the world is to make promises to people in London about services coming and then not materialising. We'd rather know we've got the funding and then have a plan around the services Londoners need commensurate with the monies we've got from TfL.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Garrett.
Good morning. In your 2016 manifesto, you spoke repeatedly about being the most pro-business mayor that London's ever had, and you repeated that language in your 2021 manifesto. And I just wonder whether the most pro-business mayor that London has ever seen would introduce a boundary charge cutting off businesses, customers, suppliers in outer London, from the people that they need and the people that they serve just over the boundary.
Look, I want everyone to come to London to do business, to work, or to come as a tourist or a student. That's why we have the campaign London is Open. London is Open is a fantastic campaign, one of the most successful campaigns London's ever launched. And at the core of London is Open wasn't simply about being pro-business, encouraging businesses to come to London, but it's about our values, being open, inclusive and welcoming, the very opposite of the impression given, fairly or unfairly, by the Brexit referendum. The only reason a greater than boundary charge has been considered is a requirement from the government, which is to come up with £500 million worth of additional revenues by 2023. We said to the government there's a very easy way to fill that requirement that you've got on us, which is to devolve to London the monies you raise from Londoners through the vehicle exercise duty, which by remarkable coincidence is £500 million. If the government gave London the £500 million, that would meet the government requirement for us to provide £500 million worth of revenues. In the absence of that, if the government still keeps its requirement for £500 million, one of the options we're considering to raise £500 million, as required by the government, is a Greater London boundary charge. And so we'll have to wait and see how the cards fall in relation to what the government does in 3 weeks' time, what the government does in relation to requirements going to April 2023. I hope the government realises it's no good for anybody, us having to bring in additional revenues over and above what we've been doing. But let's wait and see what the government decides to do.
But you recognise, though, that the damage that would do to business in outer London?
Well, I recognise that anybody who's going to pay additional charges doesn't find that welcoming. And that's why I say to the government that the national recovery is contingent, I believe, in a London recovery. The London recovery is contingent on TfL getting the resources it needs to provide a world-class service. I don't particularly like anybody having to pay charges that I need to pay. And the government has been given alternative ways where they can fill that black hole.
I think the point that I'm hinting at, and I'm going to make explicitly, is that the damage that it would do would more than outweigh the benefit that you supposedly would get from it. So the entire thing is counterproductive, is my point. So if we look at the outline business case that we have from the report from January, the overwhelming majority of the income would be from fines. The actual revenue from the charge would be very, very small. And so it just seems pretty obvious, do you not think, that the damage that it would do to the businesses, not on day one, but over time, as businesses find it harder and harder to operate in that part of London, all the way around, it's a very large area, the damage that would do, surely you can see that would more than outweigh the very small amount of money that it would raise. Leaving aside the assumption about fines, which is literally just an assumption, it's the net revenue from the charge is only about 110 million, which is some way short of what you need. And I think, is it not obvious to you, the damage that would do far outweighs that in terms of lost business rates, in terms of lost tax revenue from wages and so on. It'd be far greater than that.
Chair, I think we're in danger of giving the impression we disagree on issues that we probably agree about. What I'm suggesting to you, and apologies, it's probably my fault, not yours, speaking at cross purposes, is this is not something I'm running towards wanting to do. Right? It's saying the government's got a requirement. We've got to provide this additional revenue. I'm saying to the government, that's a big, big ask for us. It's a big ask for us. There is a way you can, if it's the case, you want us to fill this hole, here's how you do it. What the government's asked us to do is come up with options. And this is one of the options we've given to the government. It's not something I'm somebody who's running towards thinking this enthusiastically. I am enthusiastic about the offload emission zone. I'm enthusiastic about consulting on a new congestion charge. What I'm not enthusiastic about are the options the government's required us to do. And if you can persuade your government to be less anti-us, hopefully this won't be a requirement that's going to happen.
Sure, but my point is this is not an option because this doesn't deliver what you're saying it would deliver. That's my point, is the net effect would be negative. But I think we've probably said all we need to say on that. So coming back actually to a point that you said initially in response to Assembly Member Hall's question about transparency, I think I asked you, might have been in September, about the feasibility study that was talked about in the January report. When will we see the feasibility study, the more detailed numbers and the work that's been done on this?
Is this linked to the original question, which is how are you ensuring you deliver all the manifesto commitments?
I mean, I appreciate the Mayor may not wish to tell me. Well, the Manifesto for Commitment was to be the most pro-business mayor ever. We want to know in Outer London how much damage the mayor is doing to our businesses.
Don't you think you should stick to the question?
I think I have just stuck to the question, Assembly Member Cooper. I would like the mayor to tell me how his commitment to being the most pro-business mayor ever is creating so much uncertainty. And one of the things that would at least try to peel back some of the uncertainty is producing the feasibility study, which I'm sure, you're all interrupting him, I'm sure the mayor is about to tell us he's going to send to us any minute now.
Sorry, Chair, you ruled. I'm a bit confused by this interaction.
It is a question. It's broadly in the area of manifesto commitments. So.
Ever.
Possibly. Would you like the question repeated, Mr. Mayor?
Sorry, just if you don't mind.
Would you like the question repeated, Mr. Mayor? Please.
Taking into account, Mr. Mayor, your commitment to transparency in your manifesto and your commitment to be the most pro-business mayor that London has ever seen in both of your manifestos, when will we see the feasibility study work on the boundary charge?
Chair, I mean, I've got no issues with that work being published. The issue is the government permission. So I think we're in negotiations with the government. I've been criticised in the past by your leader, Susan Hall, for making transparent negotiations in real time with the government and correspondence with the government. And I'd be criticised, I'm sure, by your leader, Chair, if I publish those whilst we're in negotiations. Once the negotiations are finished and the government's happy, more than happy to publish those studies and stuff. But what I wouldn't want, Chair, is for your leader to criticise me again in relation to that stuff being published.
Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Devenish, please.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor. In your manifesto, I'll say that twice for AM Cooper's benefit, in your manifesto, with regard to Hammersmith Bridge, you said you will continue to work with local authorities to deliver the ferry. Well, there's no ferry. I think the ferry's been put on hold, understandably. Could you please update me, reference where we're going with Hammersmith Bridge, please? And I'm sure everybody would have seen the Economist article of last week that London's bridges are falling down. We don't need this bad publicity. Thank you.
Well, Chair, I'm surprised the member isn't aware who owns the bridge and the progress taking place with the government's task force. And if he needs a briefing, I can ask the relevant government minister to give him a briefing. The position is that the government has a task force, a number of people on the task force, including government representatives, the government's junior transport minister, the deputy mayor for transport, representatives of Hampstead and Fulham Council, and others as well. They're working incredibly hard to find a solution to the challenges. Because of the good work of the local council and their engineers, the bridge has been reopened to pedestrians and cyclists. Further work has been undertaken about the feasibility of some of the options presented by the engineer. As soon as there's a viable option, I'm sure all the parties, not just the parties on the task force, but the residents and the businesses will be welcoming the go-ahead. But it can't happen until the task force, chaired by the government minister, has signed off on this. And I'm surprised he wasn't aware of that. But I can ask them to drop him a note as the relevant member, so he's briefed and up to date on that.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The point I was actually making is it's taken so long that we're getting back in the national and international press because it's gone on and on. Could I ask if you could please talk to the Deputy Mayor and perhaps organise a public meeting with the task force, you're right, but also with the London Borough, Hammersmith and Fulham, who work at a glacial pace, and TfL, please, because unless we get a public meeting, I think this is going to go on ever and ever.
Well, I think the right people to organise a public meeting would be the Secretary of State for Transport, Grant Shapps, who went down to the bridge and made a promise to reopen it should his guys at Goldsmith win, and then went back again to make a promise with the Tory candidate for mayor. And I think local residents would be really pleased to welcome the Secretary of State or even his junior minister to a public meeting to explain why a few years on they still haven't managed to give the funding the council desperately need to have the bridge reopened, and I'm sure that would be a public meeting really well attended.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mayor, for that really helpful answer. I'll try something different. On page 54, Assembly Member Cooper, of the Mayor's Manifesto, Mr. Khan said, quote, "Use the unique opportunity of COP26 in the UK this year to showcase London's leadership on climate action." Mr. Mayor, you spoke an awful lot at COP26 and I enjoyed every word you said, but there wasn't that much about what you and the GLA family could be doing, for example, in retrofitting GLA buildings, for example, in improving your vehicle fleet. Is there any more that you, not the government, please, or Assembly Members Cooper's friends, the government could actually, the Assembly, the GLA could actually do to help our environment, please?
Chair, I think there may be something wrong with the member's microphone. It's a bellow when he speaks. Maybe somebody could look into the bellowing coming from Assembly Member Devenish's area. But the short answer is I'm incredibly proud of the leadership shown by London, exemplified by my election as the chair of C40 from global mayors across the world. And what we were able to show at Glasgow was best illustrated when Senator Polanski talked about our pride in Glasgow, about doing some of the things we're doing, from the world's first ultra-low emission zone. I'm really proud that 3 cities across Europe, indeed 3 cities in our country, are emulating the ultra-low emission zone. We've now expanded it 18 times the size of the original ultra-low emission zone. It's now double the size of Paris, an example of world-leading policies.
Chair, sorry, he's not answering the question yet again. The GLA family, what are you doing about the GLA family, the things you directly control?
You've got to, at some stage, be impartial.
You could actually answer a question.
It's now 11:30, Chair, come on.
You haven't answered a question yet.
You should have woken up by now.
It's up to members to question you in the way that they wish. There was a question there.
Could I move on, Chair? I have one more.
I've not answered the last question, Chair.
No, you never answer any of them anyway, so I won't worry about that.
How are you going to do this, Chair? How are you going to do this? He scared away the gallery. He's now in danger of...
You've bored away the gallery.
Can I ask the member, are you now moving on to another question?
I've got another question, and just for Assembly Member Cooper, who seems to have left to find a copy of the manifesto. On page 57 of the manifesto, Mr. Mayor, you committed to making London, I quote, a zero-waste city. This question is really specific, Mr. Mayor. Please concentrate. Question. What is the target recycling rate for London by the end of your term of office of May 2024?
Well, Chair, I'm sure the Greens and the Lib Dems are really pleased they voted for you to be the impartial chair of this Assembly. And I think the way you've chaired this meeting today has been disgraceful, Chair.
Right.
Let me answer the question.
Mr. Mayor, this is not the first meeting you've done this. If you've got a complaint, you write it down and you use the procedures. Can you answer the question, Assembly Member?
Is there a question?
Chair, you've been
I look forward to your letters, Chair,
You've been really partial. You've been really partial.
I look forward
even
to your
more
letter.
So than normal.
I look forward to your letter,
which is
Mr.
unlike
Mayor.
you,
In the
usually
meantime,
you're so partial.
I'd like you to come here
You've
and do
exceeded your
your
own
job, which
standards,
is to
which are low
answer
enough as it
questions.
is.
Would you like to answer the Assembly Member's question?
Well, I was answering the question and then I was interrupted by a further question. And the answer to the question was, we've shown the leadership over the last 5 years by some of our policies, which are world-leading, from the world's first ultra-emission zone, from most electric buses of any city in Western Europe, from the most...
Chair, I know I'm asking about
points.
garbage in this question, but the Mayor hasn't got to speak garbage. You can just answer the question.
Assembly Member, the Mayor was answering your question.
Really?
Yes. From the largest number of rapid charging points of any city in Western Europe, we now have more than a third of the charging points in the country, more than 7,000. In relation to recycling, I'm really surprised the member doesn't realise that this is a power devolved to the 32 boroughs. If he's suggesting that the Mayor of London should be in charge of refuse and collection from the 32 boroughs, he should say so now, and we can see if the London Council will agree to the power to refuse and collection and recycling being given to the Mayor. I'm somebody who believes in devolving power down, not taking powers away from councils, and I'm working with the councils to improve their recycling rates. One of the things that I've been keen to do is to make sure that we can have, particularly in those homes in London which are flats and which are more difficult in relation to refuse collection and recycling, to support those families or those individuals living in the flats to have better refuse collection and better offers of recycling, and working with councils on a cross-party basis, outer and inner, to make sure we can have at least waste from food recycled and collected and separated. We can have recycling better done for
Thank you, Chair. I think I'm
and
trying not to use any more time up on this. I'm not going to get an answer to the question. Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Prince.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor.
Hi.
You seem to be enjoying this afternoon.
It's still morning last time I checked, but yeah.
Well, that's true, yeah, that is very true. It must feel like a very long one too. So earlier you quite rightly mentioned your work on cleaning up the air in London, and also you mentioned taxis specifically as part of that work that you're doing in having cleaner taxis and so on and so forth. But in your in the 102 pages of your manifesto, you actually only mention black cabs once, and I was just wondering whether that was intentional, but also you claimed, if you would agree with me, that you know how difficult the last 12 months have been for the black cab sector. So could I ask you, you may or may not know that you did bring in a rule where the Euro 5 diesel taxis now only have a life of 12 years rather than 15. But you may well also know that there's been a lot of work to upgrade those Euro 5s to Euro 6. Do you know what progress is being made on that, Mr. Mayor?
So do you mean retrofitting?
Yes.
I can write to the member. I've not got to hand the details of retrofitting work.
So could I just ask you another question on the back of that? Because you know, I believe you would want to be helpful on this. The fact is that all the work has now been done by the trade on retrofitting Euro 5 to 6, but in order to authorise these, there needs to be road testing of the system, which, as you may well know, is the final step before they can be approved. But TfL has yet to even look at a converted cab. So would you, Mr. Mayor, be kind enough to ask Mr. Byford, that before the next MQT next month, he can report on progress on TfL actually working with the cab trade to ensure that these conversions are authorised?
So, Chair, for clarity, is the question, can the Commissioner give an update to the member in relation to the progress of retrofitting?
Well, it's more than that, Mr. Mayor. It's would you use your not insignificant influence on TfL that they hurry up to get the testing done so that these cabs can be converted?
Sure. I've got to be honest. I mean, TfL's focus on the next 3 weeks is trying to get a deal over the line.
No, I understand that.
I'm more than happy to ask the Commissioner to look into what the members.
Would you like me to write to you as well, Mr. Mayor, so that you
if you don't mind,
understand?
I'm
No, it's a
not
bit complicated.
sure if I understand. Yeah, do you mind?
That's fair dinkum. All right. Oh, by the way, next Thursday I will be sleeping rough in Romford to raise money for the homeless. Would you like to join me, Miss? Would you like to join me, Mr. Mayor?
Please use your time to keep.
What a manifesto commitment that's in the
Would you like to join me?
Please keep.
Amazed you didn't ask them all to sleep,
Assembly Member Best.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Chair, sorry. In both of your manifestos, you made commitments to tackle the gender pay gap in London. So is it a source of personal regret to you then that both the gender pay gap has increased under your mayoralty as well as the ethnic minority pay gap?
Sorry, Chair. Do you mean across the country, across London, or in the GLA?
In London, you made a commitment to reducing it in London. Is it a source of personal regret to you that it has increased in London? And by the way, that's a great point, Mr. Mayor. It's decreased across the UK.
So, Chair, I'm not sure that's right. I think we're using different figures. So, one of the first things I did as Mayor was to voluntarily publish by both ethnicity and gender, the pay in the GLA, and I asked those who are members of the GLA functional bodies to also do that, because I think unless you measure it and you can see it, you can't really see if there's a problem or not. Another example, by the way, I know your leader, Chair, will be pleased to hear this, of me being the most transparent mayor in the history of this city. And so we published by both gender and ethnicity pay in the GLA and functional bodies. And no surprise to those who know this area, it showed there's a big gap in relation to both gender and ethnicity. Not content with publishing both pay by gender and ethnicity, we then set up action plans to try and reduce the gap between those who are of different gender or different ethnicity. And those action plans have borne fruit with a number of policies. We have sponsorship policies, mentoring policies, and other policies to address the issue of the gender pay gap. And we've asked the functional bodies, TfL, Met Police Service, London Fire Brigade, development corporations to do the same. And this leadership from City Hall led to others in the private sector and public sector also voluntarily publishing their pay by gender, less by ethnicity. We're trying to encourage more to do by ethnicity as well. And that's led to people recognising there's an issue and taking action to do so. In some areas, we've made good progress. In gender, for example, we've made really good progress. I think at the year before the pandemic, we got down to, I think, 1%, or maybe less than 1%, the gender pay gap. Not as good progress in relation to ethnicity. but there's not been a sufficient progress made across the country and across other sectors that we'd have liked to have seen. We're going to carry on redoubling our efforts, though, because it's really important we do reduce the gender pay gap and the ethnic pay gap as well.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think I was extremely patient there to listen to that answer, because the first thing you said was that I didn't have the right figures, so perhaps I can keep you abreast of those. When you took office in 2016, the gender pay gap was at 16.15%, and after rising steadily over your mayoralty, it's now at 16.1. It's come back down slightly, but 16.19%, so it still is higher than when you took office. And to contrast that with the UK, when you took office in the UK, the gender pay gap was 18.2%, and it is now 15.39%. So it is coming down UK-wide. In London, it's going up. In the ethnicity pay gap, when you took office, it was 27%. It's now 28.2%. And if you compare that with the UK, it was 3.6 when you took office. And it is now 1.6%. So it has gone down drastically across the UK. Only in London is it going up. So I'll ask you again, and just for the final time, is that a source of regret for you?
Chair, as I said, I don't recognise those figures. I'm more than happy to share with the member the figures that we have for the GLA functional bodies, and for the figures we have across London and across the country. The fact there is a gender pay gap and there's an ethnic pay gap is not acceptable. And that's one of the reasons why we've led by examples with world-leading policies on these areas that many others have emulated. It's because it's not acceptable to me that we have these policies and that we've talked about it for the last 5 years and taken action. We wouldn't have had an action plan if we didn't think it was a priority. And again, no previous mayors published these figures or had an action plan to address this. The London living wage increase that I announced earlier on this week of £11.05 an hour will disproportionately benefit women and black aged minority ethnic
At the end of the day, Mr. Mayor, just to leave it there, because it's not working and it's a manifesto failure, and that's not the question. I asked you if it was a source of regret, the figures, that was all. Because whatever you've done hasn't worked. From when you took office to now, it hasn't worked. The data has gone in the other direction. I think that's it. If you don't want to answer the question, then please, can we leave it there?
I think the member should speak to some of the families benefiting from the London living wage. The member should speak to some of the families benefiting from the recruitment, retention and progression as a consequence of our policies, and the member should speak to some of those across our city benefiting from some of our world-leading policies from City Hall, leading to greater equality, not just in relation to gender, but also in relation to ethnicity as well. That's one of the reasons why I felt so angry when the government claimed there wasn't institutional racism, when the government claimed there wasn't structural racism, when the government turns a blind eye to issues of violence against women MPs from senior members of the Tory party, as was highlighted this week.
Mr. Mayor, we've got 30 seconds for you to try and answer the question, so one more time, is it a source of regret? Is it a source of regret that the figures have increased under your mayoralty? It's a simple yes or no. Is it a source of regret that the figures in London have increased under your mayoralty whilst they've reduced UK-wide?
Well, once again, Chair, I'm answering the question, interrupted when I'm answering, and as usual, the Chair sits on his hands. The point I'd make, Chair, is we've got world-leading policies in relation to a number of these areas, and I'm keen to...
If you could bring your comments to a close, the GLA Conservatives are now out of time. If we can now move on to Assembly Member Harani.
Thank you. The previous Mayor of London promised to eradicate rough sleeping by 2012. It doubled in the last 5 years of his mayoralty. Promised there would be staffed ticket offices at every station, and then closed all of London's ticket offices, and denied that he had plans to cut fire engines or stations, and then closed 10 fire stations and removed 27 fire engines from office. It's really surprising that at this Mayor's question time, the party opposite have decided to talk about transparency, given what is happening with the corruption scandal in Parliament that mars their party as well. But Mr. Mayor, how would you assess your record of delivery on manifesto commitments against the previous Mayor of London?
Well, look, I think one of the things we've heard over the last 40 minutes is really useful examples of deflection from the Tory chair and members of the Assembly. And that's why it's really important for Londoners to be reminded about the record of the Tories when they were in charge of City Hall versus our record since I've been the Mayor in May 2016. And we know they don't like it because of the deflection and the misleading information. And by the way, these are the very same arguments. Their candidate for the mayoralty of our city put to Londoners in advance of May. Never before has a mayor won the votes that we secured in May, which shows it was rejected by Londoners, and I'm confident it'll be rejected going forward as well.
Thank you.
Assembly Member Moema.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to first start by saying how mortified I am by the conduct of members today, especially when we had so many people here that had come along to observe this last meeting of the Assembly in this place. It is shameful to those young people that were sat here today to see a demonstration of democracy and the way that this Assembly has conducted itself and that the way that this meeting has been chaired. But with that in mind, and in the spirit of the manifesto commitments, I wanted to ask you, Mr. Mayor, in light of the comments made about saving car parks rather than building houses, what contribution to your manifesto commitments those new homes on TfL land would make to addressing the housing crisis? It cannot and should not be the case that we are fighting to save car parks. We are heckling people. By all means, nod and smile. I'm still speaking. I listened to you with great grace, Assembly Member Best. I didn't to you, but I did to Assembly Member Best. So with that in mind, can we look at what the contribution is to the crisis in availability of homes in London, the double benefits of building homes near public transport, removing air pollution and improving air quality, and removing the need for private vehicles?
Look, I've always been courteous and given credit to the Greens and the Lib Dems, but they're responsible for this chairmanship, and you should reflect on this when it comes to April and May, because the chairmanship today has been a disgrace, Chair. You have exceeded the usual partiality in relation to the chairmanship. That being said, this is what you get, right? That being said, I also agree with you that the behaviour of our chair and some members of the Assembly was disgraceful. Now, they were playing to the gallery. We know they were playing to the gallery. But others who saw this will have seen they're on the side of those who want to park their cars next to a station, as opposed to those who are desperate to have genuinely affordable homes in this great city that we call home. And I've got to be clear, over the last 5 years whilst I've been there, I've been seeking to address the housing crisis, not a so-called car parking crisis. And the reality is that we've got really good transport links, as you have next to a tube station. They're often the best place to build genuinely affordable homes, often high-density homes, and without the need for car parking spaces, because you've got very good transport links. And we've heard today members of the Assembly defending the right of those outside London to drive to a car park next to a tube station to park their car, as opposed to Londoners desperately in need of affordable homes within London. And this is the reason why they got spanked in May in the council election, in the mayoral elections. And we look forward to campaigning between now and May in the council elections.
Thank you.
No other contributions on this. We're now hit about mid-time for that. Best time for a 5-minute break. So if we just adjourn for 5 minutes with the consent of the Assembly, yeah. So we come back here at 11:53. There we go.
GLA Chamber Sound. 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 GLA, chamber, 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 sound.
One member short vote of quorum. Okay. We just short one member. Oh, we're good to go. Everyone ready? Now, if we can carry on with the next question on the paper, which is about the Mayor's action plan for improving transparency, accountability and trust in policing. And that is in the name of Assembly Member Russell.
Keeping our city safe relies on strong relationships between the police and all of London's communities. That's why in November 2020 I published my action plan for transparency, accountability and trust in policing. We've made good progress in the years since we published the action plan. The Met Police Service has conducted a review of pre-arrest handcuffing and focused on recruitment and outreach to increase the number of black recruits. It has also implemented community-led training to ensure new recruits understand the local communities and neighbourhoods they are serving, including training led by Londoners who have lived experience of stop and search. I've made £1.2 million available to the MPS over 3 years to support the progression and promotion of black officers and a further £700,000 to invest in community-led training programmes. The Public Attitude Survey has been extended to ensure the voices of London's black communities are better represented. Claire Waxman, London's Victims Commissioner, has engaged directly with black women survivors to ensure their experiences are better understood. MOPAC regularly publishes updates to provide transparency in the work they're doing, and they're also establishing an external reference group to further embed community experience and community expertise within our work. I've commissioned research into the effectiveness of cannabis enforcement in tackling violence and a review of community engagement and scrutiny functions to ensure Londoners' voices are heard. The Met Police Service has published its new policy on handcuffing, reiterating that handcuffing needs to be justifiable and properly recorded, with that justification clearly explained. Additional training for officers began last month, emphasising that handcuffing should not be routine. I'm grateful to all those involved, including the many Londoners that continue to help shape this work. We must be under no illusion about the scale of the challenges the action plan seeks to address. There is no quick fixes to the complex issues that affect all public institutions spanning across generations. This was shown sadly this week by Asim Rafiq and Yorkshire County Cricket Club. Improving the trust and confidence all Londoners have in their police service is one of the key themes of my draft Police and Crime Plan, which I launched for public consultation this week. The tragic murder of Sarah Everard by a serving police officer has further damaged public trust and confidence in our police service, and I've been very clear with the Met Police Service about the changes that public need to see. As Mayor, I'll continue to do everything in my power to champion these efforts to ensure London's police service can regain the trust and confidence of the people it serves.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and I appreciate you've been doing a lot of work on police powers, working with black communities and working to ensure police better understand communities. Now, I want to pick up on police accountability and disproportionality and raise with you a recent example of a lack of transparency. So in July, I asked you about the demographics of people who had their e-scooters seized. My intention was to check whether there was any disproportionality. The response in September said, and I quote, "The Met do not have the data to be able to report against this." So I was very interested when the charity Possible recently used FOIs to the Met to ask about the demographics of people stopped for e-scooter offences. These FOIs revealed that black Londoners were over 3 times more likely to be stopped for e-scooter offences than white Londoners. So the data clearly does exist and reveals a worrying disproportionality. Now, your answer to me, to the written question, wasn't quite right, and I understand that the Met would have provided that information, but are you comfortable with that lack of transparency?
Chair, no. I mean, look, what the member raises is a source of concern. If the information exists and it's easily providable, it should be provided, particularly when your function in a democracy is to hold me and the police to account. That's how we engender more confidence. And so can I, Chair, with your permission, take this away and speak to my Deputy Mayor and you to see what went wrong, but to reassure myself there aren't other examples where things may have gone wrong.
That would be great. I'm not here to gotcha the police, but as you say, my job as an Assembly member is to scrutinise, and I can't do that if I don't have that information. Now that I've made you aware of this, and I welcome your response, can you also consider, in the spirit of the transparency aim of your action plan, to commit to reporting the data on e-scooter seizures so it can be scrutinised to check for disproportionality? And will you add it to your action plan dashboard?
Which I'm not sure how easy or difficult it is, but let's work on the basis it's not difficult. If that's the case, then I think we should make it, we should provide it, not just to you, but it should be provided. So can I, as part of the work that you're going to do with my Deputy Mayor and myself, take that away as well? And if I don't see why, if it's the case that information is available, we're not providing it.
Thank you very much. That is a welcome commitment. Now, there are some outstanding actions that the Met need to do for the Police and Crime Committee that stretch back to the 15th of May 2018. That's over 3.5 years ago, which is actually longer than your second term as Mayor is going to be. Only 34% of October's written Mayor's questions about policing were answered in the MOPAC agreed timeframe, and September was 61% and July only 37%. So will you speak to MOPAC and the Met about their openness and transparency with the Assembly?
Yeah, some of that, Chair, I'm more than happy to, of course I am. Some of that is simply, I think, bandwidth. What we are criticised for doing is having too many staff working for MOPAC, doing the accountability stuff that's so important in a democracy, and trying to pivot the resources towards frontline services. So we've got to make sure we balance the resources around that. But if it's the case that the staff who are there should be providing swifter responses, but they aren't for reasons, we've got to look into that. Again, can I take that away and speak to my Deputy Mayor and the Chief Executive and see what the source is and why that is the case and rectify it?
Thank you very much. That's very welcome, and I've got no further questions. I'm out of time.
Thank you very much. The next question concerns investment in climate change and in the name of Assembly Member Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. COP26 has underlined that we must do much more to tackle the climate emergency, and we need to act now. The Climate Change Committee said that the UK must scale up investment to £50 billion every year from 2030 to deliver net zero. Despite the spending review claiming to deliver £30 billion in public investments for net zero, commitments to date fall well short of what is needed, not even meeting the government's manifesto commitment of £9.2 billion. Focusing investment on the energy efficiency of buildings reduces emissions and tackles fuel poverty. So I've prioritised securing significant energy efficiency funding for London. This includes £8.5 million for my Warmer Homes programme, an additional £29 million from the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, and working with London boroughs, over £120 million through the Public Sector Decarbonisation Scheme. I also expect to receive funding from the Government's Sustainable Warmth Fund, but the long-term trend of London losing out on the energy company obligation continues, with London only receiving 4.7% of the fund while contributing 13%. It's not a good story for transport either. TfL's medium-term capital plan asks for up to £1.5 billion additional funding per year to support decarbonisation, including by encouraging public transport over car journeys. We did not receive any of that funding. Neither will London receive any of the national £1.2 billion bus fund announced in the spending review. Funding for climate change adaptation is also out of sync with the impacts we're already experiencing. Funding for local adaptation of close to £1 million a year was withdrawn in 2016, and there is currently no government support for local authorities, businesses or communities. This means there is very limited capacity to include adaptation in development plans, enforce building regulations or require enhanced building standards. In short, we don't yet have the funding that we need for long-term planning or resourcing we need from the government to get to net zero or adapt London to a changing climate. That being said, I'll continue to do what I can to mobilise funding and finance in London to tackle the climate emergency through a Green New Deal mission, my Energy Efficiency Fund and the development of a finance facility for London.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Mayor. I mean, I am worried that COP26 should have been a critical moment for the UK to really show climate leadership. and I agree with you that Alok Sharma did a very good job, but I'm very concerned that the Chancellor's budget has not shown the same kind of ambition that Alok Sharma clearly wanted the summit to deliver. And one of the areas that I'm really concerned about is getting business on the page for that transformation. I know that a lot of people in the public sector, councils and obviously the GLA, are completely on the page for trying to move on. But there's a lot of businesses, I think, who need support from government and I think need clearer guidance. Would you agree with me that we need to be doing more to support businesses moving forward?
Look, let's be frank, we're not going to get to zero carbon, we're not going to address the climate emergency without the private sector playing its role. And there's a huge appetite amongst the private sector, but they need support. I think actually the Chancellor's announcement with Mark Carney during COP was welcome. I want London to be the green capital of the world in relation to green finance, in relation to what the FTSE does, the London Stock Exchange and so forth. But they need support from government. I'll give you one example where the government can support businesses. Businesses want to be moving towards future-proof sectors, future-proof jobs. One of the ways is for them to have a certainty of work. If the government was to say we're going to have retrofitting of buildings, that means businesses will invest in insulation, in triple glazing, in solar panels, in training up their staff, and so forth. And so the government's going to give them that. Same goes with electric buses, electric taxis, charging points, and infrastructure. And that's why it's really important. You know, the government realises this is an opportunity. There's an awful crisis. We can turn that into an opportunity. And if we don't, by the way, the Germanys and the Frances and the others will. So, you know, we've got to make sure we're ahead of the game, particularly post-Brexit. What is our role? I think it's high-skilled, well-paid green jobs.
Yeah, I think it's about getting that framework, isn't it, so that business is very clear going forward that if small and medium enterprises, exactly the opposite of what happened actually when the feed-in tariff, which was introduced by Ed Miliband when he was the Secretary of State and was then suddenly destroyed about 3 years later and hundreds of little companies went under. That's exactly what we don't need. I just wanted to turn to one other area as well. Biodiversity is often not considered an absolutely critical part of moving forward, but in London I think we have tried to start moving towards your net zero 2030 target. I really think we need to be thinking about what more biodiversity can do to help us with the carbon sequestration that we clearly need. Is that something that you can work on alone, or again, is that something where we need the government to be giving clearer signals about how we should move forward?
Look, I think, of course, we want the government support, but we can do stuff, and we are doing stuff ourselves. When you look at the London Plan, which protects our green spaces, you know, protects the green belt, but also protects biodiversity, encourages new biodiversity. I was both pleased and slightly concerned to see, because of our policies and other policies from other people, the River Thames is now welcoming back biodiversity. My concern was apparently that sharks have been spotted in the River Thames. It makes me a bit nervous, but obviously it's great news that we're encouraging dolphins, sharks and other wildlife back. But we've got to be thinking about that. And actually at the London Plan and some of the investment announced in the green infrastructure supports our biodiversity, but it's crucial. There's a meeting my Deputy Mayor Shirley Rodriguez and I have in next week with a leading expert on nature and biodiversity, which will help us think about what really bold pioneering plans we can have in London.
Well, I'm very pleased to say that the peregrine falcon that lives near Battersea Power Station is alive and well, and they've actually been fledging quite a number of, I don't know whether they're chicks, but they've been having quite large families over the last few years. So I think there is quite a lot of biodiversity in London. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. The next question is about the climate emergency in the C40 cities group, and that's in the name of Assembly Member Hirani.
Thank you. I'm honoured to have been elected as chair of the C40 Cities Network, representing nearly 100 cities from around the globe. That's over 700 million people and a quarter of the global economy. The world is at a crossroads in the fight against climate change. More than half of the world's population live in cities, and this will grow to around 70% by 2050. Cities are at the forefront of climate change and are central to solving it. I have three key priorities for the role. The first, addressing the twin dangers of air pollution and climate change. Second, I want to ensure that our recovery from the pandemic addresses the inequalities that have been exacerbated in our cities by the pandemic. I've said that 2/3 of C40's next annual budget will support action in the global south cities that have contributed least to climate action but are most severely affected by its impacts. And thirdly, I'll be calling on national governments to stop delaying to act now, or let cities get on with it. And cities are leading by example. More than 1,000 cities have already pledged to halve their emissions by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. Governments around the world must empower their cities to do even more by devolving the necessary powers and funding.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I know it's been referred to plenty of times in this meeting before, but let me actually congratulate you on your role as the C40 chair. And I know it's an incredibly proud moment, probably not only for you, but actually for all of London to have us on that global platform, and that should be rightly recognised by this chamber. At the COP26 summit, you led a delegation of city leaders, and since then have said that you've been inundated with requests from fellow mayors around the globe about the ultra-low emission zone and the expansion of the zone and the work that you're doing in London. Looking closer to home, how are you working with other members of the C40 group and with the government to spread the best practice that we are seeing in London with other cities?
Yeah, we should be proud of the progress we've made over the last 5 years. So not only working with the 97 cities on C40, but working with UK 100, who have 100 towns, cities, regions, villages in the UK doing great work on this area. And so one of the things I'm really proud of is we had in London something called Breathe London, the biggest network of air quality monitors of any city in the world, which let us understand in real time how bad the air was. That's going to be rolled out globally to Breathe Global with the generosity of our donors, and so other cities can see in real time how bad the air is and take action. And one of the problems we have is you can't see this stuff, particulate matter, nitrogen dioxide. It's not like the smog in the 1950s. And that's why it's so important to measure it. But there are other examples of good practice we're sharing, from Barcelona to Bogota, from Dundee to Birmingham. Other good things we're doing. And this week when I met with Andy Street, the Mayor of West Midlands, we discussed his experiences of the Clean Air Zone and ours of ULEZ. And we need that synergy because national governments are kicking the can down the road to 2035, 2045, 2060. And the point I think Zach made is that I've said that the cities are doers, whereas governments are delayers.
Mr. Mayor, a lot of the work that you've done in London appears to be in the absence of government action. What would you like to see the government take forward immediately to make sure that cities across our country can benefit from clean air?
Well, the first thing they've got to do is make sure we get a deal in 3 weeks' time for TfL. Right? You're not going to encourage people to use public transport, to walk and cycle when we're having to reduce services. That will lead to a car-led recovery, replacing one health crisis, COVID, with another one, poor air quality. What the government's got to do is have a plan, though. I think Leonie referred to this around a Green New Deal. If the government invested in electric buses across the country, right, better quality air, less emissions, but jobs are being created around the country building these buses, from Ballymena to Falkirk, from Scarborough to Leeds, from Guildford to other parts of Yorkshire and the Midlands. Same goes with electric taxis and so forth. So the government's got to realise that this crisis is actually an opportunity, and it's a virtuous circle. And particularly post-Brexit, we can now be making sure these buses are made in the UK. And a good example of London helping the rest of the country, because 9,000 of these buses are in London. And a good example why the government giving us a deal in 3 weeks' time benefits jobs around the country. The Piccadilly Line trains are made in Goole. The electric buses are made in, about Falkirk and Ballymena, other parts of Yorkshire. That's really important for the government to understand that unless they get involved, not only will we not address the twin challenges of climate change and air quality, but you'll lead to jobs that aren't future-proof, more paid.
And following on from ULEZ, there's a report recently which showed that Londoners are ditching diesel vehicles 6 times greater than the rest of the country. So with this in mind, is there any other further messages you can send to government on pollution of vehicles and how that can boost manufacturing? And will you commit to working with manufacturers to get some of that data on what it actually means to the economy of this country?
Yeah, one of the points, you raised a really important point about the pivoting from polluting diesels to electric. I'm in favour of West Midlands getting the gigabyte factory, and I was really disappointed when I heard the Transport Secretary talk against that in favour of Coventry Airport. And so this is a good example of me being an ally to the Mayor of West Midlands. I want them to get the factory because they make the electric batteries. We don't do it in London, right? And I'd rather those jobs, with respect to my friends in mainland Europe, those jobs go to the West Midlands than other parts of the globe. And we've got to think about this, particularly in the context of security. So there's been a big discussion about energy price increases and the lack of security of energy supply. And the same must go for the supply chain, generally speaking. So let's try and think about how we can use the crisis of climate change to provide opportunities. And that's a really good example, the pivot from diesel to cleaner forms of transport. Where do we think these electric taxis, more than 4,400 in London, more than any city in the country, are made? They're made in West Midlands, in Coventry. I visited the factory recently. And the same goes for electric buses, bikes. We have record numbers of cycle hire bikes. They're not made in London. They're made in the East Midlands and Stoke-on-Trent. So it's really important the government realises there are opportunities here. And I'm really proud, by the way, to have fewer diesel vehicles in London, to have fewer diesel buses in London, and to have incredibly clean vehicles being used in London. The ideal, of course, is public transport, walking and cycling, and that's why the next 3 weeks are so important.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question concerns extreme weather events and the London Fire Brigade, and that's in the name of Assembly Member Clark.
Thank you, Chair. I've not yet received the full details of the spending review settlement from the government. I expect to do so in December. The £3 million per year increase in baseline funding was proposed specifically to address safety in the built environment to help the brigade keep Londoners safe. As the London Fire Brigade helps to respond to extreme weather events, my submission called on the government to maintain real terms funding so that the brigade's capacity to meet the increasing challenges of climate change is not reduced. The heavy rain that occurred in July this year, which caused serious flooding across London, demonstrated the impact of incidents caused by extreme weather events. Over a 4-hour period, the London Fire Brigade received 1,755 calls related to flash flooding and attended 1,430 incidents as a result. The impact of climate change mean that incidents caused by extreme weather are projected to become increasingly common. Maintaining real terms funding for the brigade would help ensure that firefighters are equipped to protect Londoners both now and in the future. Currently, the brigade is able to deal with incidents caused by extreme weather, as demonstrated by its response to the flooding events in July. The LFB has conducted a flood response project to identify new equipment and training requirements, as well as how the brigade can collaborate with local partners during flooding incidents. All London firefighters are trained in water rescue, and the brigade has 24 specially trained officers who can provide advice in anticipation of severe weather warnings and a range of specialist equipment to cope with more frequent sudden rainfall. It's essential, though, that the response capability in London is maintained, and I'll work with allies and the Commissioner as well as the Deputy Mayor to make sure we're in the best position to do so.
So thank you, Mr. Mayor, for your recognition of this causing a lot of concern. And thank you also to the Fire Brigade, who continue to work really hard throughout very challenging times. Mr. Mayor, there is clear evidence that climate-related events are increasing significantly from year to year, and that these climate change trends are likely to intensify over the coming years. Is the government aware of the burden this places on the London Fire Brigade?
At the moment, no. That's one of the jobs that we've got to do, is to persuade them why it's important. I'll give you a simple example where the government doesn't. Put aside the Fire Brigade for a second. The Environment Agency gives funding for flooding, but it tends to be flooding caused around coastal parts of the country or the rivers. It doesn't take into account the flash flooding we saw in London this summer, and doesn't take into account the impact that has on the LFB, the Met Police Service, and others as well. And we've got to make sure the government realises the impact it has. And if we're going to respond, we need to have the resources to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And has the London Fire Brigade identified what financial support will be required over the coming years to deal with this increase in extreme weather events, and as you talked about, the specialist equipment they may require?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the LFB, just to reassure Londoners, are in a good position for the now. The LFB needs help, though, for the future and the near future. And so this July, I deliberately mentioned the number of calls they've received and the incidents they referred to. That gives you an idea of the scale of the challenge they had. At one stage, the control room couldn't cope with the number of calls being received because of the flash flooding. And notwithstanding, working closely with the Met Office in relation to weather forecasts and so forth, we will need more equipment. And by the way, we give mutual aid and help other parts of the country as well. And so it's really important that we support them where we can. We can't do it alone, though, as London. We need the government, the Home Office, to step in and help out. And what the Commissioner has done is given a case explaining the equipment we need, and we're asking the government for their support.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. The next question concerns private renting. I beg your pardon. I'm so sorry. Assembly Member Bakari.
Great. The LFB does an excellent job on fire safety outreach with businesses and schools. Will you push for similar work for flooding prevention outreach?
Chair, the LFB does, but I can ask them to send the member details of what they do just to reassure her. And if there's other ideas she's got, more than happy to take them on board.
Thank you very much. Well done with 23 seconds, may I say. That wasn't bad at all. We could all learn from that. The next question is private renting and homelessness this winter, and that's in the name of Assembly Member Moen.
Chair, I'm sorry those who came here and heckled aren't here to listen to this answer to this question. I hope the Tory members who were articulating and playing to the gallery do listen to the answer to this question. I'm very concerned that many Londoners are facing a tough winter. The government is choosing to make a difficult situation even harder by adding the universal credit cut and the end of the eviction ban to the ongoing economic uncertainty, all while rents are continuing to rise in London. Throughout the pandemic, I lobbied the government to provide grants to help renters clear rent arrears caused by the pandemic so they could stay in their homes. And I've welcomed the £65 million additional homelessness prevention grant announced last month to help renters. It will not be enough to protect many of London's renters from eviction, but it's an important step and an acknowledgement of the government's responsibility to act. An increasing proportion of Londoners rely on benefits to pay their rent, and now around 2 in 5 private rented households. For many Londoners, the benefits they are entitled to don't cover their full rent. I fear the government's removal of £20 a week from universal credit on top of the precarious situation many renters already find themselves in will leave many Londoners unable to pay their rent. I was hugely disappointed to see the spending review detailed plans for local housing allowance rates to remain at April 2020 levels into 2022 and 2023. Benefit levels need to recognise the cost of renting. As things stand, I have limited powers to act directly, but I'm lobbying for these immediate actions from the government. I'll continue to make sure we build genuinely affordable homes in London where they are needed, and I'll continue to help rough sleepers and to increase the supply of affordable housing, the ultimate solution to homelessness.
Thank you, Mayor Khan. And thank you for that. I think it's really important to demonstrate the complexity of homelessness. As you rightly touched on, there's street homelessness. There are also those in the private rented sector who have been forced into statutory homelessness. And the universal credit cut in the last few months has only exacerbated that situation, with a significant number of boroughs who are not able to afford private housing in their own boroughs. But I want to ask you about the Everybody In scheme, which during the pandemic did have some success significant success with providing accommodation to about 90% of street homeless people through that period. And just wondering what conversations or additional funding you might expect to make sure that that programme can be continued, and to make sure that the rising numbers of street homelessness and statutory homelessness as a result of the pandemic and people losing their jobs can be addressed and doesn't continue to go up.
Yeah, these are particularly pertinent questions, bearing in mind the weather's getting colder outside. So Tom Copley's done a really good job coordinating with councils across our city, housing charities, experts, NGOs and so forth in advance of this winter, which is really, really important. So you'll be aware the Everyone In policy arose from, we had an In for Good policy we've had since I became mayor, which is when somebody is seen by one of our severe weather emergency shelters or one of our partners, and we get them in, we try and keep them in for good so they don't go back out on the streets with the wraparound care that they need. And that showed, as you said, 9% of those who we saw stayed in for good. The issue is the pipeline of new people who become rough sleepers. And so the work we're doing this winter will repeat the good lessons we've learned in previous years, including, for example, I changed the protocols around when the SWEPs open, when the severe weather accommodation opens, so they open far speedily, even when it's only 0 degrees or approaching 0 degrees on one day rather than 3 days, and all across London rather than just in some boroughs. But we need support from the government. Councils are really struggling with the cuts they've had over the last 11 years. The CSR didn't give them the monies that they'd hoped for. Tom and my team are speaking to the government. I welcome Michael Gove being the new Secretary of State. I think he gets it, and so we're going to talk to him about what support we can give this winter. And I just remind colleagues who may not realise this, but I suspect there'll be more people being made homeless, rough sleepers, as well as social homelessness, as a consequence directly of some of the policies from the government. And that's why it's really important we stop people being homeless in the first place, as well as giving the support to get them off the streets if they are.
Thank you. And just, I was going to ask you about your work with the Deputy Mayor Copley's work, but you have covered that. So I just wanted to say that I've asked you on a few occasions about the progress that we have made with the Private Renters Commission and other work that we are doing to try and encourage the government to devolve some of those powers to London so that we can provide protections for people. And I just want to extend my ongoing support and kind of advocacy for that particular position for Londoners, so that we can make sure that we have some controls over the market here in London, and that we're able to protect people in their homes.
Just the two pieces of good news there, because there's lots of bad news, is that some of our colleagues in the Build to Rent Centre are providing rent freezes for a period going forward, which is really, really encouraging. The bad news is we still haven't persuaded the government to give us the powers that we need for a private renters commission, or to have a rent freeze in those properties, not and some of our friends in the Build to Rent Centre. It is really important. You've seen the inflation figures.
Yeah.
You've seen that the wages aren't going up by the inflation figures. Something's got to give.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. The next question concerns Prevent in London, and that's in the name of Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. Terrorism remains a significant threat to our society, as the tragic murder of Sir David Amos MP and the explosion outside the Liverpool Women's Hospital this week have shown. The pandemic left people more isolated and spending increased amounts of time online, and extremists have used this opportunity to spread their hateful ideologies to those vulnerable to radicalisation. It's more critical than ever that our national counter-terrorism strategy includes a fit-for-purpose plan to identify and assist those vulnerable to radicalisation, as well as those who have already been indoctrinated. My Countering Violent Extremism programme delivered the most comprehensive engagement and review exercise in this policy area ever, including a full and frank assessment of Prevent. It found that Prevent has done some good work, no doubt saving lives, but it also found significant shortcomings. Referrals from friends, family and community members in particular are low, resulting in missed opportunities to intervene. Sadly, we've also seen instances where individuals previously referred to Prevent, alongside those known to have held violent extremist views in prison, go on to commit acts of terrorism. The programme's final report set out that it was time for a rethink to make Prevent more effective. Some improvements have been made since then, such as the introduction of the Act Early campaign, but more needs to be done. I welcomed the government's decision in January 2019 to deliver an independent review of Prevent, and I look forward to reading the recommendations and the government's response. However, this review has been dogged with problems and is well behind schedule. I've invested more than any other mayor in this area, including delivering £1.4 million in funding through my Shared Endeavour Fund for grassroots civil society projects that counter hate, extremism and radicalisation across the capital. I'll continue to do what I can in London to strengthen our communities against extremism, as I know the member Unmesh Desai is doing as well.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for that detailed answer. Mr. Mayor, as we know, anyone can make a referral to the Prevent programme, including social media companies, if they wish to. However, I recently received data, about which the Met spoke about at yesterday's police committee and confirmed my understanding, which showed that no referrals to the Prevent programme in London have ever been made by a social media company. Considering the type of extremist content that social media companies monitor and remove from their sites, what more could they be doing to keep us safe? And do you think it would help if there was a duty on these companies to make referrals to the Prevent programme?
Well, thank you for your question, and thank you for raising a really, really important issue. Look, I mean, let's just park and accept social media, generally speaking, is a great thing, and we all use it, and we can see the benefits of social media to our society and so forth. But self-regulation is clearly not working. Right? It's not working. And I think the Online Safety Bill is an opportunity to address some of the concerns we have. I think there is an issue, we haven't got time to go into it now, with a legal duty, and we need to weigh up the pros and cons and to make sure that it worked. And I'm hoping that the combination of the online bill and the independent review addresses some of the points you've raised, really, really important points. What I'm quite clear about is social media companies aren't doing enough to address some of the propaganda, hate messages that come that are on their platforms, and that they need to do more to take action against the users who exploit their technology to spread hate and disinformation, but also they've got to change their algorithms and how they reward bad behaviour, which is what they're doing, which clearly can't be right.
Thank you. I think I have about 2 more minutes left, so I've got to ask you this question, Mr. Mayor, in the light of recent events in the cricketing world. Sports plays a big role, as I'm sure you'll agree, in bringing communities together, promoting community cohesion, which is so important in terms of the issues we are talking about here. You referred to the Yorkshire cricketer Azim Rafiq earlier, and I think in response to a question from Assembly Member Russell. Will you join me in condemning the inaction of Yorkshire Cricket Club in particular, but other cricket clubs that we now know of and counties, in tackling the deep-rooted issues of institutional racism, and welcome any moves to establish an initiative similar to that in football? Kick racism out of football is what I'm thinking of here, as advocated by the chair of the Common Select Committee that took evidence from Azim Rafiq. I think something that moved us all so much, so it was such a powerful sort of testimony from him.
Yeah, I've got to look. It was uncomfortable to watch what was said, but I recognised a lot of what was said, and a lot of it didn't surprise me. And I was reflecting on why I stopped playing cricket with certain teams, and then in my later years played for Asian-only teams. And it is an important issue that's been highlighted that we've got to think about. The best way to prevent radicalisation is for us to mix and mingle more. And sport unites. And what sport does is it brings people together from different backgrounds, different races, different religions. Some of my best friends I've met through sport. But if it's the case that the way sport is conducted, run, regulated, leads to people not feeling comfortable or welcome in a mixed environment with different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different religions. So they join in mono-ethnic, mono-religious teams. That can't be good. And that is a breeding ground for those who want to divide communities and have a propaganda of hate. And that's why many of us were triggered by what was said. Because as brave as he was, we recognised it. And Lord Patel, who's a friend, I declare an interest, who's now taken over at Yorkshire County Cricket Club, has got a tough but important job to do. Because many of us love cricket, love playing cricket, love watching cricket, and we love the fact that our world champion team had Muslims in there. It's a source of pride that Moeen and Adil were in the England team that won the World Cup. But it can't be right that Adil Rashid's experiences are not dissimilar from some of those we heard this week. He's an England World Cup champion, right? And that's why it's a problem. And so I think we've got to kick it out of all sports. We've got to kick it out of cricket. We've got to kick it out of society. And I want to commend what Azim Rafiq did this week. I want to commend him for his bravery over the last few years. I think he probably had a fantastic career that was wasted because of racism. And I think the book should be thrown at all those responsible. And the ECB has questions to answer as well. They've got questions to answer as well. And I'm hoping action is taken.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I've got 2 other questions, but I'll put those 2 in writing.
Thank you. The next question concerns youth unemployment, and it's from Assembly Member Sheikh.
Thank you, Chair, for this important question. With furlough now ended and the latest figures showing youth unemployment still above pre-pandemic levels, it's crucial that we do all that we can to support young people as part of London's wider recovery. Through my Academy's programme, we're investing to help Londoners most impacted by the impact into good jobs in sectors that are key to London's recovery. My £32 million Good Work Fund, £11.5 million Careers Hubs and No Wrong Door programme will provide a high-quality offer of skills, work experience, careers advice and mentoring to support young Londoners and people most in need into good work. Through the adult education budget, we're supporting Londoners aged 19 plus to develop a range of skills and access support to find work. In 2019 and 2020, around 24,500 young people aged 19 to 24 enrolled in 46,000 courses. As part of the new deal for young people, we're also investing in a programme to increase high quality and inclusive mentoring opportunities in London's growth sectors so more young Londoners can benefit from mentorship with industry professionals, working closely with London's anchor institutions on how they can support the new deal for young people through funding, technical assistance, coordination and communications, as well as recruitment of mentors. And through the London Recovery Board, we're working with partners to ensure that young Londoners are aware of the opportunities available to them and can make the most of them to find good work and to flourish.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, and good afternoon to you now. I mean, perhaps it's me attempting to cling on to my youth, but I would say that the precarity of rent, the escalating cost of living, the precarity of the employment landscape that you've just, we were discussing means that I think even beyond the age of 24, the precarity of youth is still felt to people sort of even in their 30s. And so for me, what anchored this particular question was, in the pandemic, 80% of job losses were by those under the age of 35, and that is devastating, really. And so for me, I think it's really fantastic to hear you outline what you're doing to support young people in London to get back into employment. And I think one of the things I wanted to address in that process is even once we have young people in employment, the nature of the gig economy and the precarity of the kind of work that comes from 0-hour contracts means that many of young people are in exploitative employment practices or experiencing it. So what is it that you can do to protect our young people who are experiencing exploitative employment practices?
Look, Chair, if the member thinks she's trying hard to hold on to her youth, so I'll have a conversation with her offline about my attempts at trying to hold on to my youth. Look, it's a really important issue you raised. When I began my career, I reflect, because I was in employment, in a sort of career that had a progression. There was training, there was a clear career path, there was security. And, the generation aged 18 onwards haven't got the same career path in most of the jobs out there. And the new jobs, by the way, in the gig economy, haven't got that career path, the training, the security. You just think about, and I know you know many young people, the difficulty is getting a mortgage, right? Let alone, providing the security to a landlord to get a property, and so forth. It's really important we think about this. And I commend, by the way, I know a lot of people in this assembly, thankfully not the majority, are anti-trade unions. Look at the great work that the GMB did in relation to getting a recognition agreement with Uber for some of their drivers in these uncertain economies. And I commend Uber, by the way, for recognising GMB and the great work GMB did. And that's one of the reasons why, collective organisations, collectively organising can lead to improvements in the workplace. But one of the things we've got to do is recognise that the gig economy is here. So how do we make sure it's fit for purpose going forward? And that means regulation, keeping abreast of developments, but also things like what happens to paying off taxation and so forth. And so we've got to understand the challenges young people face and also try and support them. And that's what we are seeking to do in City Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I mean, I accept we have to recognise the gig economy is here, but I do struggle to reconcile my acceptance for it staying. I think it should be on its way out, because I think not only does it, like we say, sort of create precarity of employment once it's been bought, but I think even, and I'll move on to this next part, which is of my follow-ups, which is the current working conditions of some young people once they get work. And actually, I think talking about union recognition in workplaces is incredibly important, and I think they are absolutely the backbone of those who negotiate our working conditions. And for me, one sort of campaign that was brought to light to me when I was at my Unite policy conference is around the hospitality sector. 9 out of 10 people in the hospitality sector, regardless of gender, have experienced sexual harassment, and I found that astonishing. For me, 9 out of 10 is essentially saying everyone in the hospitality sector has experienced sexual harassment, and I wonder what are we doing to kind of say boldly that misogyny, sexual harassment in any industry, but particularly in the hospitality sector, is unacceptable. Just to add a sort of small layer on why this is particularly insidious is, especially given the precarity of trying to be able to get work, a lot of what I've been told by hospitality workers is there's a bigger dependence on tips, and so it kind of creates quite a high threshold of desensitivity to sexual harassment because it tops up their wages. So, there's a melting pot right now of exploitative working practices, and particularly on the point of sexual harassment. Can you just let me know what you're doing from City Hall to protect our young workers, not just in hospitality but beyond?
Well, thank you for raising this really important issue that affects a lot of Londoners and a lot of people across the country. And you use the word desensitising is really important. Look, a lot of this sexual harassment is a criminal offence. But if people have less trust and confidence in the police, don't be surprised if there's underreporting.
Exactly.
So we've got to make sure there's more trust and confidence in the criminal justice system. We've got to make sure certain things are criminal offences. Misogyny should be a hate crime. The harassment of people in public space should be a criminal offence.
Absolutely.
We've got to make sure we address some of these big changes, but also we've got to make that workplace safe. One of the things we've been working on, you asked what we're doing specifically, Amy LeMay's done a great job in relation to getting more and more organisations signed up to the Women's Night Safety Charter, which sets out expectations on businesses. And the great news is more than 600 businesses, nightclubs, restaurants, bars, those in hospitality have signed up to the Women's Safety Charter, which gives responsibility on staff members, but also members of the public as well. Really important. Similarly, the Ask for Angela scheme, but also the toolkit we've set up after listening to experts in violence against women and girls. Two other things we've got to do is make sure, inverted commas, whistleblowing is far easier. Grievance procedures in workplace, including proper disciplinary procedures. Look, a member of Parliament this week said, right, she was the victim of criminal assault, by the way. That's a criminal offence. Didn't have the confidence, and there are many people who were nodding their heads because they've probably experienced something similar, to report this. And so it's not just people in hospitality, it's others in jobs who haven't got the confidence to come forward. There are often good reasons, previous experiences, that can't be right. And we've got to, at the same time, be tackling the behaviour of men, right? Because at the core of this is how my sex is behaving, right? At the core of this. So yes, of course, we've got to make sure better support for women, better support for girls, better support for those working in hospitality. What about the guys doing the stuff, right? Take action against them, throw the book at them, arrest them, charge them, tackle their behaviour. There's got to be more of that. And that includes people like me being an ally and talking about it and calling it out and doing much more from City Hall. But there's a big challenge. And the final thing is, this is one of the reasons why trade unions are a wonderful thing. Right? If you work in hospitality, join a trade union. Because a trade union would be your ally, your advocate and your friend here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Could I ask members of the public gallery that if you're going to have a telephone conversation, that you leave the gallery in order to do so, because it is an interruption to business. Can I also ask Assembly to agree to suspend Standing Order 2.9b in accordance with the provisions of Standing Order 1.1h in order to allow the remaining business on the agenda to be completed? Thank you very much. The next question on the agenda concerns vacancy rates in London's NHS, and it's in the name of Assembly Member Dr. Sahota.
Thank you, Chair. I share the RCN's concerns about the government's failure to act decisively to address NHS workforce shortages. Vague references in the spending review to, and I quote, hundreds of millions of pounds in additional funding to ensure a bigger and better trained NHS workforce, end quote, gives me little confidence. We need a clear funded multi-year government plan to invest in NHS workforce expansion, education and training. Despite an increase of 13% in nursing, midwifery and health visiting staff over the past 4 years, the vacancy rate in London is 13.5%. That's 9,445 posts. Although I have limited powers in this area, I continue to champion, challenge and collaborate with London's senior NHS leaders on workforce issues through regular meetings with Sir David Sloman, NHSEI London Regional Director. We also discussed health and care workforce challenges at the London Health Board meeting this week. I'm proud to host access to the Capital Nurse Programme on the GLA website, and I'll shortly be announcing details for a health skills hub as part of our new Academies programme.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for that chance, for that answer. Of course, we're talking about the heroes, the nurses and doctors, the heroes of the nation who are clapped every morning, unlike these Tory MPs who are in the Virgin Islands, taking advantage of the pandemic, double-dipping their earnings and voting remotely. We're talking about people who went morning and night time looking after patients who were COVIDly ill. they were the heroes of the pandemic. They ran towards the risks rather than running away to the Virgin Islands. So I want to just put this on record, the tremendous debt we owe to the NHS workers, right, who have worked very hard and who have been lining their pocket in the pandemic. This government has treated them like villains, giving them a derogatory 3% pay rise when their inflation rate is 4.5%, demoralizing them. They feel they are leaving droves to the NHS, right? The commitment to increase 6,000 GPs by 2024-25 has now been shelved because the government accepted they can't deliver it. Given all this, right, okay, do you think this government is helping London deliver a service to look after our NHS workers? And how can the government help us more in London so we can look after our heroes?
Well, firstly, Chair, can I through you thank Dr. Sahota for the work he does for the NHS and members of his family who work for the NHS and others indeed who work for the NHS and the social care sector as well. I was at St Thomas's Hospital this Monday and was hearing myself from some of the practitioners the consequences of the last 18 months, which has compounded the consequences of austerity for the last 11 years in relation to staff morale, staff fatigue, staff mental ill health, overworkedness, tiredness, but also vacancies. And my concern is not simply the issue you've addressed, which is how they feel let down because they have been let down, but the impact it has on others joining the NHS. Because why would you, if you've seen how colleagues you may be thinking about joining have been treated over the recent past? And I think it's really important that we don't take for granted the NHS and those who work in the NHS. We don't take for granted that these vacancies, almost 10,000 vacancies in London in the NHS. Put aside social care for a second, and that's why it's really important that the government recognises this. I've recently been watching the programme made by Ed Balls on BBC about social care, which has opened my eyes to actually what goes on and what people were telling me last year inside those care homes and how they are transformative in relation to the care they provide those who are older. It's really important the government steps in to support what is a service that is in danger of collapsing.
Yes, of course, Mr. Mayor, and I work in the NHS, as you said, my family work there, and my colleagues, they are very upset by the way the government treats them and starts to put a wedge between them and patients. But let's just see what we can do in London to help our NHS staff. Are you concerned by the government's plans to cull the BTEC courses and its potential knock-on impact on preventing thousands of working-class young Londoners from going to university to train as nurses and health care workers? Can you use your academy's programme to help to train up some of the capital next generation nurses?
Well, I discussed this matter with the Education Secretary recently, and it's not about wanting to get rid of BTEC courses for the sake of it or because they don't want people to go to do these great jobs in the NHS. It's a question of simplifying the qualification. It's quite a complex area. So we know about A-levels is quite straightforward, GCSE is quite straightforward. There are lots and lots of BTEC courses, and that sort of simplicity and clarity would help us. So as far as the FE sector is concerned, we've now been involved in the adult education budget. We are looking at health academies. We're talking to those who are experts in social care about working with them in relation to social care academies because of the massive vacancies, but also these are really fantastic jobs if the government recognises this is an area that's going to be growing and gives them the resources they need. So we are working with FE sector. We are speaking to the government, and I think actually, I'm always I'm always happy to criticise. I want to commend Nadeem Zahawi in relation to his collegiate way of working. I'm hoping he'll listen to some of the concerns you're raising, and I'll certainly make those points to him the next time I see him as well.
And the other thing, of course, is that cost of housing is very expensive in London, and social housing isn't readily available. You proposed the idea that maybe nurses and doctors can be, well, rather nurses and healthcare workers can be given priority for social housing. How have we progressing that idea?
Yeah, so look, the key concern we have is we've got now record numbers of council homes being built. Great news. Many of those who work in the NHS aren't eligible for those council homes because their wage may be slightly above the income threshold. So how do we help those who are working in the NHS be able to afford to live in London. They can't afford the luxury penthouse flats that were built in previous years. So we've got to make sure there's intermediate housing that's less than the market value that they can have access to. And so we are doing a lot of work with councils, with housing providers, to ensure that there's key worker housing reserved for people in the NHS, like those who work in the health and care sector. We've recently hosted a Housing for Key Workers event with key partners, and I'm hoping to make an announcement shortly about the first key workers being given these intermediate housing in London.
And one other thing, of course, the government could help us with is giving us a fair settlement for TfL. The cost of travel is very expensive. And if we're going to, do you think the government could help us by giving us a long-term settlement for TfL so that we could consider giving concessionary travel or subsidised travel to our NHS workers?
Well, just so that we've given NHS workers access to the reimbursement scheme for the ultra-low emissions, and really important to do so. The government wanted us to remove free travel for those above the age of 60 and free travel for those who are children. We managed to resist that last year. Most of the Assembly was on my side in that campaign to resist that, and I thank members of the Green Party, the Lib Dem Party and the Labour Party for their support. But I think we've got to keep what we got. Of course, if we had more monies from the government, if we had a good recovery, we'd look at more areas of concessionary travel. I've got to be honest, though, my concern is to avoid massive cuts in bus and tube services, as well as potential road and bridge closures, and I don't want to give the false hope to colleagues in the NHS in that area.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Assembly Member Desai, you've got 35 seconds.
35 seconds, okay. Mr. Mayor, government has shown that there's a link between misogynistic attitudes and extremism. What more work do you think needs to go into de-radicalizing those with deeply misogynistic views, and what are you doing from City Hall in this area?
There's clearly links, Chair. It's unequivocal now between misogyny and extremism. We're doing lots of work with the Shared Endeavour Fund to address both these things. Some of the things we're funding address both these issues. I think the reality is, if you were to do research, as we've seen done, on those who are terrorists and extremists, the vast majority also hate women.
Thank you. And I think your message about support for Azim Rafiq, that will go all around London. I'll make sure of that. I think we all really applaud that. I've had a lot of messages already on social media.
Thank you.
And,
thank you, Assembly Member.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
You owe us 16 seconds there. But make it up next time, absolutely. Assembly Member Pigeon, I'm assuming you've withdrawn your question. Thank you. 4 seconds is an ask, isn't it, for a question? The next question, therefore, is the cost of travelling by public transport, and that's in the name of Assembly Member Berry.
Thank you, Chair. Since I was first elected in 2016, keeping public transport fares low has been a top priority for me. As well as introducing the Hopper bus fare, allowing passengers to make unlimited free bus and tram transfers within an hour, I froze all pay-as-you-go fares for the whole of my first term as Mayor. Fares only increased early this year because they were required to do so by the government as part of the last TfL funding deal. Public transport remains the cheapest and most attractive option for many journeys. Hopper bus and tram fares are £1.55 and pay-as-you-go fares are capped daily and weekly. The daily charge for travelling in zones 1 and 2 is capped at £7.40, which is considerably less than the congestion charge. I've also protected concessions, including the 60-plus Oyster card and the under-18 Zip cards, despite the government's best efforts to have them removed. It's fair that, like public transport users, people who drive pay for the full impact of their travel. London suffers from the worst traffic congestion in the UK, and the congestion charge is designed to encourage motorists to use other modes of transport. It has helped London become the only major city in the world to see a shift from private car use to public transport, walking and cycling. Of course, it would be unfair for people using the TfL public transport network to carry the burden of a lack of adequate funding from government. It's unfair that revenue raised from car owners in London is not available to pay for the upkeep of the roads they use in the same way that, for example, tube customers pay for the maintenance of the trains they use through the fares they pay. This leads to a situation where London public transport users are subsidising London private car drivers, and that's why I've repeatedly called on the government to devolve London's share of the vehicle excise duty to the capital. As we approach the deadline for the next TfL funding deal, I hope we can work together to lobby the government before December the 11th.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. And Chair, I don't think I was expecting to have tabled the last ever Mayor's question answered in this chamber, but I appears to be in that position, so let's make it a good one.
Depends how long you go on for.
So thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. And it's, I mean, other cities are far behind us on this relative cost of driving and public transport, but I've been looking at the bigger picture across London, trying to add up every kilometre that people travel and every penny that people pay on different modes. And no matter what I do, it comes out that people are paying more per kilometre for public transport travel across the piece than for driving in private cars. And if you're expecting people to change behaviour, the macroeconomics of this just are not right. We're not following the road user hierarchy in economic terms if people are paying less per kilometre to drive than they are to take public transport. So if this one important lever, the macroeconomic lever, isn't being pulled right now, how are you, Mr. Mayor, proposing to fix this?
The problem with your question is it's based on an assumption there hasn't been a shift from private car use to walking, cycling and public transport. There has been, which shows our policies are working. We've seen a shift since the ULEZ was introduced. We've seen a shift before that with the C charge. I'm hoping to see a further shift with the expansion of the ultra-low emission zone. It is a fact, as I'm regularly reminded by my friends up north, that public transport in London is cheaper than other parts of the country. But the fact I remind them is driving a car in London is far more expensive than other parts of the country.
I mean, I agree. We're ahead of other cities, and I agree that, you know, we've been talking all day about the other levers that you might use. But the way I see it, I think I've always talked about having a prescription of 3 active ingredients, if you like, to clear congestion. Space on the ground, prioritising space on the streets. Service, genuine and improving public transport, better buses and trains, and then price, these relative costs that we've been talking about. Now, in reality, we've got some councils reversing street space measures. We've got on public transport, you know, huge jeopardy in terms of improvements because of the situation with the government. So, because we're not changing, getting the modes of transport relative costs right either, literally none of these active ingredients are actually active right now in London. So I've asked the question about cost because there is this important thing that I've talked about many, many times in this chamber that you have not taken action on, which is smarter, fairer road charging. And I want to know if you're making any progress on that particular active ingredient.
But again, the first part of your question is a misrepresentation because we have got the boldest active travel policies of any global city in the world. We have increased fivefold the amount of safe cycling in our city. We have now increased the amount of walking space by 21,000 square metres. And so we are providing active travel in our city. We've now got more than 400 school streets just in the last year. So more and more children and their parents and their carers are walking, cycling or scootering to and from school, including parents using, teachers and staff use other forms of public transport as well. So it's not true to say we want active travel in London. And I've always said we will keep under review road user charging, including smart road user charging. And we are looking at the technology. We're doing work in relation to what we can do in relation to making sure we have road user charging always kept under review. That's one of the reasons why I consulted up until October the 6th on a permanent change to the congestion charge rather than the temporary increase imposed upon us by the government. The ultra-low emission zone expansion is a good example of the road user charge scheme. And so, look, we are always keeping these things under review.
Okay.
Always happy to work closely with you on these issues because I think both of us have the same ambition with the ends.
So, I mean, what I want to see is, I mean, in light of some of the really micro discussions that were going on earlier on, I want to keep that bigger picture in mind, to keep these 3 active ingredients going in the right direction. At the moment, they're in danger of going backwards, and we need to make sure that doesn't happen.
You're not going to be able to answer that, Mr. Mayor, because the GLA, the Green Group, are now out of time. I apologise. I think you're free to go, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Chair.
Those are all the questions. Can I ask the Assembly to agree the motion which is set out on the agenda in my... I beg your pardon.
I'd like to amend the motion
that the Assembly notes the answers to the questions asked. I'd
Yeah.
like to add at the end, put a comma and say, but deplores the way that the priority order was ignored by the Chair today. And I would like one of my colleagues to second that.
Priority?
It's being seconded by Dr. Onka Sahota.
Fine. I'd be interested to hear how that happened.
Can I just propose my motion then? Thank you.
Yes.
Is concerned by.
I can't hear you,
Is
unfortunately.
concerned by.
Rather than deplores?
Yes.
This Assembly is concerned by the way that the priority order was ignored by the Chair. Yes, I'm happy to accept your amendment. I'm making this in accordance with Standing Order 4.2, and I'd like to just speak to it. Section 4 of our agenda today is listed in the notes, the procedure notes for the Chair. It says questions to the Mayor set out on the priority order paper. And the Chair then said to us at the beginning of this section, we now move to the remaining questions on the priority order paper. Each group is allocated an amount of time and so on and so forth. The first question is the one that we took first. Each group is then allocated time and the questions are then listed in a particular order. And they're quite easy to spot what the order is because as you go down the list, you can actually see what the numbers are, but they are all listed in the order that they are to be taken. Now, we spend some time talking about the amount of time that's shared between us, but that's sort of nailed down because it's proportional. We spend some time deciding on the priority order for the plenary sessions and also for these sessions. We had a priority order that was set out at the beginning, and the Mayor and the Chair referred to it. We've adjourned, but the priority order today was completely ignored. You allowed question after question after question as follow-ons to one question at the beginning, and then all of the questions all fell away, which has then allowed a number of Assembly members to leave the chamber, and some are not even back in at this moment in time. I think it's ridiculous for us to refer to a priority order being taken in this section of the meeting if we are then just going to ignore it. Accepting your amendment, I am very concerned that we've done that. And I would like to make this point by passing this amendment to today's noting the answer to the questions asked, because I think we should try and avoid doing it in future. Otherwise, we're going to have an arms race where we all try and do it at every single Assembly meeting. Thank you.
And second, Dr. Sahota.
I formally second and reserve my position to speak.
I've seen Assembly Member Hall.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to point out that other members come in behind questions. We've always done that. We've done that as long as I've been here. The question that my colleagues came in under was manifesto commitments. Every single one of the questions that came after my question was about manifesto commitments. Yes, it was. If you were not listening, that is your problem, Assembly Member Cooper. It's not ours. We absolutely made sure that every single one of those came in under manifesto commitments. And if you play the tape back, you will hear every one of my colleagues referred to a manifesto commitment. Well, I invite you to watch back the tape and you will see, because we had a meeting about this, we knew exactly what we were doing. We did what we were allowed to. Now, if the Assembly decides that we shouldn't be allowed to do that in the future, because clearly it put the Mayor in a position where he didn't know the answers to questions, where he was filibustering and using up our time, but nevertheless, he had to answer the questions that we came in with. And some of the Labour group also asked questions on the back of my original question, because that's allowed. Now, since we're allowed to do that, I suggest we continue to do it, because actually you get questions coming from all different directions and the Mayor should be able to answer. So we will absolutely not be going along with that. The job of all of us, every one of us, is to ask difficult questions of the Mayor, not to hand him easy questions. And I felt your discomfort that the Mayor clearly was not happy with that questioning. Nevertheless, we are entitled to ask as many questions we like behind a question. As for commenting on my colleagues, one of my colleagues is very poorly. So kindly find out why somebody has left the room before you start accusing them of leaving the room for any other reason. It's actually, quite frankly, none of your business. So I'll leave it at that, Chair, because I'm quite incensed by that. And only to reiterate to colleagues, this should not be passed because we did what we were entitled to do.
Could you remind me of what the motion is again?
It's to put a comma at the end and then say, but is concerned at the way that the priority order was ignored by the chair.
Okay. So there's criticism of the chair, not members. Okay. Assembly Member Bailey.
I think there's two things that have to be said in this debate. One is you as Labour members also ask supplementary questions. So how you can then say everybody else shouldn't be allowed to ask supplementary questions when you did is astonishing to me. And secondly, this has been a right of all Assembly members since the Assembly was formed. Now, if you don't like it, that's something that you have to go away and deal with. If the Mayor doesn't like it, he'll have to do the same. But it is our right under the GLA Act to ask questions in this form. And you yourself have exercised that act in the past and this morning as well. So you have to admit to yourself this is a political tactic to prevent the Mayor of London answering the questions that the people of London would like him to answer. So if that's what you're trying to do, that's fine, but be truthful about that, because the upshot of today was the Mayor did not answer many of the questions because they weren't written down on his big book. And what's really funny about that, he likes to accuse us of reading, but he seems to be incapable of questions if he doesn't read the answer from his book. You've got to admit to yourself you're trying a political tactic, which is disgraceful because you're removing Londoners' ability to ask their Mayor questions.
There are 4 people indicating to speak on this item. The next one is Assembly Member Garrett.
Thank you, Chair. I find the motion or the amendment as put by Assemblymember Cooper, I think both disingenuous and dishonest about what has happened this morning. I don't understand how the allegation can be put that the Chair hasn't followed the priority order when the priority order has been followed perfectly and in precisely the same way that it has been followed in every previous meeting, in the sense that, for example, when groups run out of time, the questions that they still have to ask cannot be asked because they don't have time to ask them. That's not an innovation of this morning. That is something that Assemblymember Cooper will have seen over many years that she has spent on this Assembly. And so I find her proposal disingenuous. And the question about supplementary questions, the Liberal Democrat group have done that this morning. The Conservative group have done it. The Labour group has done it. I can't think that the Green group have done it this morning, but I'm certain that they have done it previously. And it's a completely normal thing to do. So I would really like, if Assemblymember Cooper is putting this as a serious suggestion and not just some sort of mischief-making nonsense to waste everybody's time, can I suggest that she clarifies in her closing remarks what exactly she is suggesting members should or should not be allowed to do with supplementary questions? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assemblymember Moema.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to add, and I'm one of those that did ask a supplementary, I think it should be noted, however, that in the taking of the questions, Chair, it was not an equal or impartial process. For example, the taking of the supplementaries was entirely from the Conservative group first, and then others. I did. Otherwise I wouldn't be standing here to say this. I think my point, though, is more about the way in which those people that came here to the last meeting of the Assembly here, what they witnessed today was not a proper debate. It was a barracking of the Mayor. And if it is the case that we want to have a plenary rather than a Mayor's question time, then that's absolutely fine. I do not pretend to know all of the standing orders of the Assembly, but we should be clear and transparent in the way that we are questioning the Mayor to actually understand, to draw questions from the Mayor for the benefit of those people here in London, so we understand what progress he is making on his policies. And like you do want to see and understand progress against manifesto commitments, but that should be done in an impartial way where we take into account not just time, but the way in which I would encourage you to look in both directions when you are taking questions, for example, in future, and that did not happen today.
Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you, Chair. I'm really sad that we are standing here in our last meeting of the Assembly in this chamber, and we're now having this discussion, and I think we should be bringing it to a close as speedily as we possibly can. I do think there are serious issues for the way that we conduct these meetings. It was a clever tactic today. The Conservatives did a question on the manifesto, and then everyone was able to jump in on that. But what it meant was that as the fourth priority order question, my question didn't get heard until after our halfway break. And I think we do have, for plenary meetings, we protect the first four questions, which come one from each group, so that those questions are heard at the top of the meeting. Now, I'd like to suggest that this is taken away by group leads and is discussed, and that we come back with, we're not going to agree or sort of work everything out at this point right now. But I would also like to add a very simple further amendment to the motion, which is actually to mention both the chair and members, because I think this is on all of us, it's not just on the chair.
Assembly Member Pigeon.
Thank you very much. I agree. It is very sad to be closing our last Mayor's question time on this note. But ultimately, we all have issues at times with whoever is chair of this meeting, and that's the natural tension. We all go away frustrated. I recall Labour members regularly being frustrated by the Labour chair in the past, and so on. And that's often the case when we get wound up in debate. But today, different groups use different tactics, which have always been there. And I recall many times in the past, to be fair, and when my group used to sit next to whoever was chair, that the Labour chair would sit there with a list of their members who they had to call in a particular order on the back of a question, because that was the tactic they were using that day. And at another meeting, they might have different questions, but all have one line that they use, because that was the message they wanted to get around. And that's fine. That's the tactics. That's the use of this chamber and so on. And the Conservatives played a game today and had a tactic, and fine, they got what they wanted out of it. I chose to use my time to come in behind my colleague's question because they were both on air pollution, and we wanted to join that together. And it also meant I didn't have 2.5 minutes of the Mayor wasting my limited 6 minutes of time. So if there are concerns, and I understand that, let's take them offline. It's not to amend the motion today. Take it offline. Let's have that discussion at group leaders, have that discussion at Bureau, and if we can find ways to come through this. But ultimately, we can use whatever tactic, the oral update at the beginning, whatever, to make our point. That's what we're here for. And today, some people didn't like the tactics group used. I think it's just, that they hadn't used it themselves today. And I think we can look at that point that Caroline Russell has made about first four questions. But the way this chamber is dynamic is when people can come in off the back. And actually, some of the best answers that this Mayor gives are when he is asked something that he hasn't got a script and he thinks, and you get to know what he really thinks. And that's when this chamber is at its best. So I would actually ask Labour to withdraw this. Let's have this discussion. You've made your point. Let's have this discussion offline.
Yeah. I'm more than welcome. We have an amendment proposed by Assembly Member Russell to add "and members," I believe. We're all as bad as each other, basically. Yeah.
That was what I proposed, yes.
So is there a seconder for that amendment? There's a seconder. Do you wish to speak to it?
No, I'll reserve my right.
Do you want to vote on that amendment of whether or not we include Assembly members as well, please?
And people have said that we'll take it somewhere else and consider it in detail. So I think I'd like to withdraw the motion, my addition to your motion.
Well, that's super. I know up in the chamber today we've got a former chair, Darren Johnson, and he, like me, have seen lots of tactics offered by groups over the years. Oh my gosh, Tony. Anyway, so we've seen lots of tactics used by groups in the way that they use their time in question time. It's my experience that, well, sometimes those tactics are successful, and sometimes they aren't. And it's my experience that other groups tend not to complain when they're not successful. So I think possibly the GLA Conservatives are walking away thinking they did rather well because it upset so many people. But I'm quite happy to take this away. We'll talk about it at Bureau, or whatever the appropriate forum is. I beg your pardon, Assembly Member Moema.
I think my point was slightly different. If you are seeking interventions, I was simply asking that you look both sides rather than taking defence just from that side.
Can I just say I'm very clear on that? I'm very clear on that because we were notified in advance I was notified in advance of those questioners. I have in the past been notified in advance for not just Labour members to speak, but also the order in which they want to speak and whether or not there should be a gap. And I've been accommodating in all those so that all groups are able to pursue their questioning in the way that they want to do it. And that's key as being chair. I understand there's concerns about today. Let's raise them perhaps at Bureau. So that being said, I've now got to revert to my original motion. Can I ask the Assembly to agree the motion which is set out on the agenda in my name, which is that the Assembly notes the answers to the questions asked? All those in favour? Agreed. The date of the next meeting. The next scheduled meeting of the London Assembly will be the plenary meeting, which will take place at 10 a.m. on Thursday, the 2nd of December, actually here in City Hall, but it's a plenary meeting, not the Mayor's question time. And there is no urgent business to consider, only to mark this little moment of history that this is the last question time. And for those people in the public gallery, our main tool of accountability is the ability to hold the Mayor to account, to ask questions and get answers. And for that reason, it is quite a moment in history that this is the final time that we will use that very important tool to Londoners, and we as the voice for London need to have that tool. It's important that this moment is the very final one in this chamber. I must admit I won't miss the acoustics and I won't miss the temperature. But short of that, I'm sure everybody's got some memories about this place that they would want to cling on to. That being said, there is no other urgent business requiring consideration, and as a reminder, there is now a briefing for members from the London Ambulance Service in Committee Room 1, starting 17 minutes ago. Thank you very much.
Yeah.